carrying around a burner phone becomes normal quicker than you'd expect. One of those cheap pay-as-you-go things, always switched off, always with a fresh SIM, always ready to be thrown in a bin if something doesn't feel right. It's the sort of routine that only makes sense after 8 months of work you'd rather pretend didn't happen. Blackpool's where the running has paused for now. A seafront hotel with stale damp in the walls and a receptionist who looks the other way when you pay in cash. The job that led to all this started out harmless enough. Writing dating profiles for people who needed help presenting themselves. Then the redundancy hit, and the clients who found me afterwards were looking for something very different. I'd been writing dating profiles professionally for about 7 years before the redundancy. It wasn't what I'd imagined doing with an English degree, but the work was steadier than I'd expected and paid better than most freelance writing. People would send me their photos, a brief description of themselves, and I'd craft an appealing profile that highlighted their best qualities, while being honest enough to attract compatible matches. The company I worked for specialized in helping people who struggled with self-presentation, usually professionals who were too busy for the trial and error process of online dating, or people who just weren't confident about selling themselves in writing. It was surprisingly rewarding work. I'd received messages from clients who'd found partners through profiles I'd written, thanking me for helping them present themselves authentically. When the company restructured and let most of the writing team go, I tried finding similar work with their competitors, but the market was saturated, and most companies were moving toward automated profile generation rather than human writers. I was 41 years old with a very specific skill set that was being made obsolete by software that could churn out adequate profiles in seconds. After a few months of unsuccessful applications, I started offering freelance profile writing services through various websites. The rates were lower than I'd been earning, but at least it was work that utilized my skills. Most clients were straightforward, people who needed help creating authentic profiles that would attract the right matches. That's when I received a message from someone who called himself Mr. Davidson. He represented what he described as a specialist matchmaking service for people who valued privacy and discretion. They needed experienced profile writers who could create compelling identities for clients who couldn't use their real information on mainstream dating platforms. The rate he offered was exceptional, nearly £3,000 per month for what he estimated would be about 20 hours of work per week. He explained that his clients were often in situations where they needed to date discreetly due to professional obligations, ongoing divorce proceedings, or privacy concerns that made using their real identities problematic. I should have questioned why anyone would need fake dating profiles rather than just using mainstream services with privacy settings. Should have wondered what kind of matchmaking service required creating false identities. But Mr. Davidson presented it as serving a legitimate market of people who had valid reasons for protecting their privacy. The first assignment seemed innocuous enough. I was given basic details about a fictional person: age, occupation, interests, general appearance, and asked to create an appealing dating profile that would attract compatible matches. The photos provided looked like standard dating site pictures, nothing that suggested they weren't of the person I was supposedly representing. I wrote the profile carefully, creating a personality that was engaging and authentic feeling while incorporating all the details I'd been given. Mr. Davidson was pleased with the work and immediately commissioned several more profiles following the same pattern. Over the following weeks, I wrote dozens of dating profiles for fictional people, each one carefully crafted to appeal to specific demographics. Some were designed to attract professional women in their 30s, others targeted older divorced men, a few focused on recently widowed individuals. I was becoming quite skilled at identifying which personality traits and interests would resonate with different types of people. The work felt legitimate enough, though I was occasionally troubled by the realization that I was creating entirely fictional people who would be interacting with real individuals seeking genuine connections. But Mr. Davidson assured me that his service was transparent with matches about the privacy arrangements and that consenting adults understood the discretion involved. That rationalization let me continue accepting assignments without examining too closely what I was really facilitating. I was just creating profiles, writing appealing descriptions of fictitious people. What happened after that wasn't my responsibility. The assignments became more specific over time. Instead of general profiles designed to attract compatible matches, I was given detailed targeting requirements. Create a profile that would appeal to recently divorced women with young children. Write a personality that would attract lonely elderly men with substantial assets. Design an identity that would resonate with vulnerable people seeking emotional support after bereavement. The targeting language made me increasingly uncomfortable, but Mr. Davidson explained that precise matchmaking required understanding exactly what different demographics were seeking in potential partners. The specificity ensured better compatibility and more successful outcomes for clients. I accepted that explanation because I needed to believe the work was legitimate. The money was keeping me financially stable, and the writing itself was satisfying in the way all good writing is. Creating believable characters, finding the right voice, making people seem appealing and authentic. The breakthrough came when I recognized a name in one of the assignment briefs. I was asked to create a profile that would appeal to a woman whose full name and location were provided, along with detailed information about her circumstances. She was a widow in her 60s, living alone in Dorset, recently bereaved, financially comfortable, and isolated from most social connections after her husband's death. I recognized her name because she was my aunt's closest friend, someone I'd met at family gatherings over the years, a kind woman who'd always been generous and welcoming, who was now being specifically targeted by someone who'd commissioned a dating profile designed to exploit her vulnerability and isolation. I realized immediately that I wasn't writing profiles for a legitimate matchmaking service. I was creating false identities that would be used to target and exploit vulnerable people through romance scams. The careful personality crafting I'd been doing wasn't to help people find genuine connections. It was to make fraudsters more effective at manipulating their victims. I thought about all the other profiles I'd written over the past few months, all the carefully targeted personality descriptions designed to appeal to specific vulnerable demographics. Each profile I'd created had probably enabled someone to be deceived by a fraudster who used my writing to present themselves as a perfect match. But what made it unbearable was understanding that my writing skills had been essential to making these scams effective. A poorly written profile with obvious inconsistencies would raise suspicions and limit the number of potential victims. My professional profiles with authentic feeling personalities and believable details made the fraudsters more credible and their targeting more successful. I tried warning my aunt's friend about the profile being created to target her, but I couldn't explain how I knew without admitting my role in creating it. I suggested vaguely that she should be cautious about online approaches from people who seemed too perfect, but I could tell she didn't take the warning seriously enough to change her behavior. Within 2 weeks, she'd been contacted by someone using the profile I'd created. The fraudster followed exactly the approach I'd designed: gradual establishment of trust, careful attention to her emotional needs, eventual requests for financial assistance that started small before escalating. My writing had given them the blueprint for manipulating her effectively. She lost nearly £40,000 before her family realized what was happening and intervened. The fraudster had used every psychological insight I'd built into the profile to maintain her trust, even when requests for money became increasingly unreasonable. My carefully crafted personality had been so believable that she'd continued sending money despite growing doubts. That's when I started documenting all the profiles I'd created, trying to understand the full scope of what I'd enabled. What I found was systematically organized fraud targeting vulnerable people across the country. The profiles I'd written weren't being used by individual fraudsters. They were being sold through hidden marketplaces to multiple scammers who'd purchase personalities designed to target specific demographics. My carefully crafted profiles were treated as professional fraud tools, priced according to their effectiveness and the vulnerability of their intended targets. I found marketplace listings offering profiles I'd written organized by target demographic and likely financial return. A profile designed to attract recently bereaved women was listed as high value because the targets were often emotionally vulnerable and had access to life insurance or inheritance. Another targeting divorced men emphasized the likelihood of success because middle-aged men were statistically more susceptible to romance scams. Each profile included not just the personality description I'd written, but also detailed guidance on how to use it effectively, scripts for initial contact, advice on building trust, techniques for introducing financial requests. My writing had been incorporated into comprehensive fraud packages that enabled even inexperienced scammers to target vulnerable people effectively. Some profiles I recognized had been used in dozens of different scams simultaneously. The same carefully crafted personality I'd created would be deployed by multiple fraudsters targeting different victims in different regions. My writing had been industrialized, turned into a template that enabled systematic exploitation of vulnerable people. But what disturbed me most was discovering profiles designed to target specific individuals, not general demographics, but actual named people whose circumstances had been researched in detail, with profiles custom written to exploit their particular vulnerabilities. These weren't opportunistic scams hoping to find vulnerable targets. They were precisely planned operations targeting people who'd been identified as especially susceptible. I found requests for profiles targeting recently widowed women whose husbands had died in specific circumstances, profiles designed to appeal to men dealing with particular health conditions, even profiles aimed at exploiting people recovering from addiction or mental health crises. Each one was commissioned with detailed intelligence about the target's vulnerabilities and designed to present the perfect personality to exploit those specific weaknesses. My aunt's friend had been one of these targeted individuals. Someone had researched her circumstances, identified her vulnerability, and commissioned a profile specifically designed to exploit her isolation and grief. The profile I'd written had been custom built to manipulate her, using everything I knew about writing convincing characters to create the perfect fraudulent suitor. The realization that I'd enabled systematic targeting of vulnerable people was devastating. But what made it unbearable was understanding how effective my writing had been. The profiles worked precisely because they were well written, because I'd applied genuine creative skill to making fraudulent identities seem authentic and appealing. I tried contacting the police about what I'd discovered, but explaining my role without admitting extensive complicity proved impossible. I'd been writing fraud profiles for months. Accepting substantial payment for work I should have recognized wasn't legitimate. The profiles I'd created had enabled serious financial and emotional harm to real people. The officer I spoke to was professional but frank. I'd knowingly created tools for systematic fraud, providing professional writing services that enabled criminals to exploit vulnerable people. Cooperation might be valuable for their investigation, but I shouldn't expect immunity from prosecution for my role in facilitating romance scams. I was advised to stop writing profiles immediately and refuse further contact with Mr. Davidson. But he'd already anticipated that possibility. I started receiving messages reminding me of the detailed records they had of my profile writing, documentation that showed my professional involvement in creating fraud tools that had enabled substantial harm. The messages emphasized that writers who cause problems would face both legal consequences and more immediate difficulties. They had my details, knew my circumstances, had already demonstrated they could research people thoroughly enough to enable targeted fraud. If I caused trouble, they'd ensure authorities understood my active role in systematic exploitation of vulnerable people. Then I found my own dating profile posted in the marketplace. Not one I'd written, but one someone else had created following exactly the techniques I'd established. It was designed to target men with my specific demographics and vulnerabilities, using the same psychological insights I'd been applying to profiles for months. Someone had turned the fraud techniques on me, creating a profile that would be used to exploit my own circumstances if I caused problems for their operation. They were demonstrating that I was just as vulnerable as all the people whose targeting I'd enabled. That's when I left my home in Kent and moved to this decaying hotel in Blackpool, abandoning my flat and most of my possessions to hide somewhere they wouldn't immediately look. I've been living on cash, avoiding digital traces, trying to work out if there's any way forward that doesn't involve either continued hiding or prosecution for my role in systematic fraud. But I know the profile writing continues without me. Other writers have probably been recruited to create fraud profiles, people who make the same rationalizations I did about just applying their creative skills to professional writing work without responsibility for how their profiles are used. The marketplace is probably still selling profiles to fraudsters who use them to target vulnerable people. And somewhere in those listings, profiles I wrote months ago are probably still being purchased and deployed, still enabling the exploitation of people seeking genuine human connection. I keep thinking about my aunt's friend, about the £40,000 she lost to a fraudster using a profile I'd carefully crafted to manipulate her, about all the other victims whose loneliness and vulnerability were exploited by scammers using personalities I'd created to seem trustworthy and appealing. The profile writing taught me that creative skills become weapons when applied to exploitation, that good writing can enable serious harm regardless of your intentions, that every authentic feeling detail I crafted, every believable personality trait I invented, every appealing quality I emphasized, it all made the frauds more effective and the victims more vulnerable. And that once you've spent months creating tools for systematic fraud, you become too compromised to report it without facing prosecution yourself. The evidence of your professional involvement is permanent, documented in profiles that show your creative fingerprints on materials that enabled serious financial and emotional harm. I suppose that's why I'm hiding in this Blackpool hotel, rather than helping police dismantle the fraud operation, because I know the profiles I wrote implicate me as thoroughly as they expose the operation, and I'm not brave enough to face consequences for choices I made when creative satisfaction and financial need mattered more than questioning what my writing skills were really being used for. All I can do is hope that someone else will eventually expose these operations, that other writers will find courage I lack to report what they're creating despite personal cost, and hope that people targeted by profiles I wrote manage to recognize the fraud before losing substantial money to scammers using personalities I carefully crafted to seem genuine. because the operations are still running, still recruiting writers, still using professional creative skills to enable systematic exploitation of vulnerable people seeking human connection. And I helped establish the standards, helped prove that well-written profiles are more effective fraud tools, helped create an industry that treats creative writing as a weapon for psychological manipulation and financial exploitation. Have you ever wondered what happens to the parts of yourself you lose in war? Not the obvious bits, the limbs, the hearing, the scars you can see in the mirror. I'm talking about the invisible pieces, the ability to sleep through the night without checking the locks 3 times, the capacity to sit in a restaurant without your back to the wall, the simple faith that most people are fundamentally decent. Those are the parts that don't grow back, no matter how many therapy sessions the doctors threw at you. I came back from Afghanistan in late 2018, medically discharged after an IED took out half my patrol and left me with a collection of metal fragments in my left leg and a head full of memories I couldn't switch off. The physical therapy was straightforward enough. Learn to walk properly again, build up the strength, adapt to the new limitations. The mental side was trickier. The flat they set me up with in Aldershot was decent enough. Ground floor, which suited the leg, and quiet neighbours who minded their own business. The occupational therapist had been very pleased with herself when she'd arranged it. Close to the base for support, she'd said, but far enough away to feel civilian. What she hadn't mentioned was how the silence would press against your ears at night, or how every settling beam and creaking pipe would send your heart racing. Sleep became something that happened to other people. I'd lie there listening to the world outside my window. The occasional car, a fox in the bins, the milk float doing its rounds at 4:30. Sometimes I'd doze off around dawn, only to wake up an hour later, feeling worse than when I'd gone to bed. That's how I discovered the internet had a whole world that came alive when the rest of Britain was asleep. Forums for insomniacs, chat rooms for shift workers, communities of people who existed in the margins of normal daylight hours. I wasn't looking for anything specific, just human contact that didn't require explaining why I was awake at 3 in the morning or why crowds made me nervous. The transition from regular internet to the darker corners happened gradually. Someone in an insomnia forum mentioned privacy tools, ways to browse without leaving digital footprints. Given my background, the concept of operational security appealed to me. Old habits, I suppose. In the army, you learn to cover your tracks, to move without being seen, to gather intelligence without revealing your position. Installing Tor felt like putting on body armor, that same sense of protection, of creating barriers between yourself and potential threats. The dark web wasn't what I'd expected. Less criminal marketplace, more like a parallel internet where people could speak freely about things that wouldn't be tolerated on Facebook or Twitter. Political dissidents, whistleblowers, people living under authoritarian regimes. It felt purposeful, almost noble. The first few weeks I just observed. Reading forums about government surveillance, privacy rights, digital freedom. There was something therapeutic about it. Being part of a community that understood the value of staying hidden, of operating below the radar. These people got it in a way that civilian therapists never could. It was in one of these privacy forums that I first heard about red rooms, not from someone promoting them, but from a discussion about online myths and digital urban legends. Someone had posted a long thread debunking various dark web horror stories, explaining how most of the sensational stuff you read in newspapers was either exaggerated or completely fabricated. Red rooms, according to this poster, were particularly ridiculous. The technical challenges alone made them impractical. Streaming live video over Tor was unreliable, the latency was terrible, and the bandwidth requirements were enormous. More importantly, they argued, the risk to reward ratio made no sense. Why would criminals expose themselves to that level of surveillance and law enforcement attention when there were easier ways to make money? The post was thorough, well-researched, and completely convincing. It also had the unintended effect of making me curious about whether they actually existed. I told myself it was just intellectual curiosity. After years of intelligence work, you develop a natural skepticism about official narratives. When someone tells you something is impossible, your first instinct is to test that assertion, not because you want to find something horrific, but because you want to understand how the world actually works rather than how people say it works. The search took weeks. Most of the links I found led to obvious scams, sites demanding payment upfront or requiring personal information that any sensible person would never provide. Others were clearly honey traps, probably run by law enforcement agencies trying to catch people with questionable intentions. But occasionally, buried deep in technical discussions or hidden in the metadata of seemingly unrelated files, I'd find references that seemed more genuine. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. I'd been helping out at a veteran support group, not talking, just making tea and setting up chairs, when I overheard a conversation between two ex-Signals operators about online payment systems. They were discussing the profit margins on different digital services, and one of them mentioned that the real money wasn't in legitimate businesses, but in providing services that people couldn't get through normal channels. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask, but something about the way he'd said it stuck with me. The next time I was browsing the dark web, I started looking at it differently. Instead of searching for red rooms directly, I started following the money, payment processors, digital transfer systems, the financial infrastructure that would be needed to support something like live streaming to paying customers. That's how I found the marketplace. It was hidden several layers deep, accessible only through a series of referral links that changed daily. The front page looked like any other dark web market. Drugs, fake documents, stolen credit card details. But there was a section marked Premium Services that required additional verification to access. The verification process was more thorough than anything I'd encountered. Not just prepayment through untraceable methods, but proof of identity that had to be cross-referenced against previous purchases, references from existing members, even a brief interview conducted through encrypted chat to confirm you weren't law enforcement. It took nearly a month to get approved, and by the time I did, I wasn't sure I actually wanted access anymore. But the same compulsion that had carried me through 3 tours in Afghanistan, the need to see a mission through to completion, kept me going. The Premium Services section was smaller than I'd expected, maybe 30 or 40 listings, mostly for things that were disturbing, but not particularly surprising. Custom pornography, identity theft services, professional harassment campaigns, the sort of services that existed in the grey areas between legal and illegal, catering to people with money and flexible morals. The listings that interested me were at the bottom of the page, in a subcategory marked Live Entertainment. 3 different providers, each offering real-time streaming services with interactive elements. The descriptions were deliberately vague. Authentic experiences, unscripted content, viewer participation opportunities. But the prices gave them away. These weren't webcam shows or adult entertainment. They were charging thousands of pounds for single sessions. I spent another week researching the providers before making contact with one. Their listing claimed to offer documentary-style content featuring real participants in authentic scenarios. The language was careful, designed to provide plausible deniability while making the actual service clear to interested buyers. The booking process was surprisingly professional. Encrypted email exchanges, detailed technical requirements for viewing, even a customer service representative who walked me through the setup process. They operated like a legitimate business, complete with scheduling systems and technical support. The session was arranged for a Tuesday night at 11:30. I was provided with a unique link and access credentials that would only work during a specific 2-hour window. The technical requirements were extensive: updated browsers, specific security plugins, a reliable internet connection with minimum bandwidth requirements. When the time came, I almost didn't connect. I sat at my laptop for nearly 20 minutes, cursor hovering over the link, trying to decide if I really wanted to see what I was about to see. In the end, it was the same morbid curiosity that had carried me this far. I needed to know if it was real. The stream loaded slowly, buffering every few seconds as the encrypted video fought its way through Tor's layered network. When it finally stabilized, I was looking at what appeared to be a basement or cellar. Concrete walls, a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, and a chair positioned in the center of the frame. For the first 10 minutes, nothing happened. Just an empty room with occasionally flickering lighting. As the video quality adjusted, I was beginning to think I'd been scammed when a figure appeared at the edge of the frame. It was a man in his 40s or 50s, wearing coveralls and latex gloves. He moved methodically around the room, checking equipment I couldn't quite see, adjusting the camera angle, preparing for something. His movements were practiced, professional. This wasn't his first time doing whatever he was about to do. A chat window had appeared beside the video player, showing messages from other viewers. There weren't many, maybe 8 or 10 people total, but they were clearly regulars. They talked about previous sessions, compared notes on different providers, discussed technical aspects of the streaming quality like they were reviewing a television program. Then someone else entered the room. She was young, probably early 20s, and clearly confused about where she was or how she'd gotten there. The man in coveralls guided her to the chair with gentle but firm insistence, speaking to her in what appeared to be a calming manner. She kept looking around the room, taking in the concrete walls and bare bulb and camera equipment with growing alarm. The chat exploded with activity. Viewers were making requests, placing bets, discussing what they wanted to see happen next. Payment details were being shared. Transactions were being arranged in real time. I watched in horrified fascination as what I was witnessing transformed from documentary into auction. I should have closed the browser, should have reported what I was seeing to the police, though I had no idea how to explain how I'd found it, or whether they'd even believe me. Instead, I found myself paralyzed by the same terrible fascination that had carried me through firefights in Helmand, that state of hyper-awareness where time slows down and you observe everything with crystalline clarity while being unable to act. The man in coveralls began responding to specific requests from the chat. He would pause, read something on a screen I couldn't see, then nod or shake his head. Sometimes he would hold up different tools for the camera, letting the viewers choose which one he should use. It was interactive in the most disturbing way possible. A live-streamed crime where the audience was complicit in every decision. Then something changed. The chat messages stopped, replaced by a single repeated warning from multiple users. Terminate session, terminate session, terminate session. The man in coveralls looked directly at the camera, his expression shifting from professional calm to genuine alarm. He moved quickly to something off screen, and seconds later the video cut out entirely. I stared at a blank screen, showing only a connection error message. When I tried to reload the page, the link was dead. The entire marketplace had vanished, as if it had never existed at all. Over the next few days, I tried to convince myself that what I'd witnessed had been staged. Elaborate theatre designed to part fools from their money. The production quality had been too professional, the interactive elements too seamless. Real criminals wouldn't operate with such sophisticated customer service and technical infrastructure. But I kept thinking about those final moments before the feed cut out. The way the man's expression had changed when he'd seen those warning messages. The speed with which everything had shut down. It felt less like a performance ending and more like an emergency evacuation. 3 weeks later, I received a package. It arrived by regular post, addressed to my flat with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, printed on ordinary paper with a home printer. It showed the interior of my living room, taken from the position of my laptop screen. I was visible in the background, sitting at my kitchen table, clearly recognizable despite the low light. On the back of the photograph, someone had written a single line in neat handwriting. "We know what you watched." I called the police immediately, reported the break-in, showed them the photograph, explained about the package. But what could they do? No signs of forced entry, nothing stolen, no way to trace where the photograph had come from. The officer who took my statement was polite, but clearly thought I was either paranoid or making it up. I've changed the locks 3 times since then, installed security cameras, motion sensors, even hired a private investigator to check if anyone had been asking questions about me. Nothing. Whoever had been in my flat had left no trace beyond that single photograph. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm lying awake, listening to the sounds of the building settling around me, I wonder if they ever really left. Because the thing about surveillance is that once you know you're being watched, you never stop feeling those eyes on you. I still get packages occasionally, never more than once a month, always delivered by regular post. Sometimes it's another photograph, my kitchen, my bedroom, the view from my living room window. Once, it was a printout of my medical records from the army. Last month, it was a copy of my therapy notes from the NHS. Each one carries the same message on the bag. We know what you watched. I don't know if it's a threat or just a reminder. I don't know if they want something from me, or if they're simply ensuring I remember what I witnessed. But I've learned that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. The worst part isn't the invasion of privacy, or even the constant feeling of being monitored. It's knowing that somewhere out there, that basement with the concrete walls and single bare bulb might still be operating. That other people might be sitting at their computers right now, watching live streams of things that should never happen, placing bets on human suffering like it's a sporting event. And I'm the only one who knows it's real. At least, I hope I'm the only one. Look, I know how pathetic this makes me sound, but I paid someone £300 to help me find a girlfriend, not a professional matchmaker or anything legitimate like that, just some bloke who claimed he could guarantee I'd meet someone within a month if I followed his system exactly. When you're 38 and haven't had a proper relationship in 5 years, you start believing that maybe the problem isn't them, it's you. And maybe you need professional help to figure out what you're doing wrong. I was working at a furniture warehouse in Swindon at the time, doing this sort of manual labor that doesn't exactly put you in contact with many single women. The few dating apps I'd tried had been disasters. Either I'd get no matches at all, or I'd meet someone for coffee and never hear from them again. My confidence was shot, and I was starting to think I'd just have to accept being alone forever. That's when I found the advertisement on one of those local classified websites where people sell second-hand cars and advertise handyman services. Someone calling himself Marcus was offering what he described as a comprehensive dating consultation service. He claimed to have helped dozens of men in similar situations find meaningful relationships using proven psychological techniques and strategic social planning. The advert was surprisingly detailed and professional. Marcus explained that most men failed at dating because they didn't understand modern relationship dynamics and communication patterns. His service involved analyzing personality types, developing personalized dating strategies, and providing ongoing support throughout the relationship building process. He offered a money-back guarantee and included testimonials from previous clients who claimed his methods had completely transformed their romantic lives. The price was steep, but not unreasonable compared to what some professional dating coaches charged. And the guarantee made it seem like a risk-free investment in my future happiness. I sent Marcus an email explaining my situation and asking for more details about his service. His response was prompt and professional, asking thoughtful questions about my relationship history, social activities, and personal goals. He seemed genuinely interested in understanding my specific circumstances rather than just selling a generic service. We arranged to meet at a cafe in Swindon to discuss his approach in detail. Marcus turned out to be a well-dressed man in his 40s who spoke confidently about psychology and human behavior. He asked insightful questions about my dating experiences and seemed to understand exactly what had been going wrong in my previous attempts at relationships. Marcus explained that his system was based on comprehensive analysis of online dating platforms and social media networks. He had developed techniques for identifying compatible partners and initiating conversations that would lead to meaningful connections rather than superficial interactions. The first step involved creating detailed profiles on various dating platforms using optimized photos and carefully crafted descriptions that would appeal to specific personality types. Marcus would help me identify the most promising potential partners and develop customized approaches for each individual conversation. He also offered access to exclusive dating communities that weren't available through mainstream platforms. These private networks supposedly included people who were serious about finding long-term relationships rather than casual encounters, and membership was carefully screened to ensure compatibility and genuine intentions. The exclusive communities required special software to access, and Marcos provided detailed instructions for downloading and configuring the necessary applications. He explained that privacy and security were essential for these premium dating networks, which was why they operated outside conventional internet channels. I paid the fee and began working with Marcus to develop my new dating strategy. The process was more intensive than I'd expected, involving detailed questionnaires about my personality, preferences, and relationship goals, along with extensive photo sessions and profile optimization. Marcus seemed knowledgeable about online dating dynamics and provided useful advice about presentation and communication techniques. His suggestions for improving my profiles and conversation skills were practical and well-informed, and I felt optimistic about the potential for success. The exclusive dating communities Marcus provided access to were unlike anything I'd encountered on mainstream platforms. The members seemed more sophisticated and serious about finding meaningful relationships, and the quality of conversations was significantly higher than typical dating app interactions. However, I began noticing unusual aspects of these private dating networks that didn't quite fit with Marcus's descriptions of premium relationship services. Many members seemed to have access to remarkably detailed personal information about potential partners, including details that wouldn't normally be available through dating profiles. Some conversations involved references to my employment history, living situation, and financial circumstances that I hadn't disclosed in my dating profiles. The level of background knowledge that people seemed to have about me was concerning and suggested that the dating networks had access to information sources beyond what members had voluntarily provided. When I mentioned these observations to Marcus, he explained that the exclusive dating communities conducted thorough background verification to ensure member safety and compatibility. The detailed personal information was gathered through legitimate research methods to protect members from fraud and deception. He assured me that all information was handled confidentially and used only to facilitate better matches between compatible people. The comprehensive background research was a premium service that justified the exclusive nature of these dating networks. Around the fourth week of using Marcus's service, I discovered that some of the women I was communicating with through the private dating networks were people who had been reported missing in various parts of the country. The photos and personal details in their profiles matched missing person reports that I recognized from local news coverage. The realization that I might be communicating with missing people was deeply disturbing. The exclusive dating networks appeared to include profiles of people who had disappeared from their normal lives and were possibly being held against their will or exploited in some way. When I tried to discuss this discovery with Marcus, he dismissed my concerns as misunderstanding the complex nature of online identity and privacy. He suggested that many people used alternative identities online for legitimate privacy reasons, and that assuming missing person connections was paranoid and inappropriate. He also reminded me that I had paid for his services and signed confidentiality agreements about the dating networks and techniques he had provided access to. Discussing these concerns with outside parties could violate our agreement and create legal complications for both of us. Marcus began demonstrating knowledge of my personal activities that he couldn't have gathered through our dating consultation relationship. He made references to my daily routine, work schedule, and social activities that suggested he had been conducting surveillance of my personal life. This surveillance became more obvious over the following days, with clear signs that my communications and movements were being monitored. The same background research techniques that were supposedly being used to verify dating network members were apparently being applied to monitor my own activities. I realized that the dating service had been used to recruit me into communication with people who were being held or exploited against their will. The premium dating networks were probably fronts for human trafficking operations, and I had been unknowingly participating in communication with victims. The detailed personal information that Marcus had gathered about me during the consultation process was probably being used to assess my suitability as a potential victim or accomplice. The dating service had been a recruitment method disguised as relationship assistance. When I attempted to end my involvement with Marcus's service entirely, he pointed out that I had detailed knowledge of private dating networks and communication methods that were sensitive and potentially valuable to unauthorized parties. My participation had created ongoing security considerations that couldn't simply be dismissed. The surveillance of my personal activities continued after I tried to withdraw from the service. Marcus's organization maintained contact through various channels, occasionally sending references to my daily activities to remind me that their monitoring capabilities remained active. I tried reporting my suspicions to the police, but discovered that proving human trafficking based on dating service activities was extremely difficult. The consultation work had been presented as legitimate relationship advice, The dating networks could be justified as premium services, and the communication activities could be explained as normal online dating interactions. Marcus's organization continued to contact me sporadically over the following months, offering additional dating assistance and opportunities to access exclusive relationship networks. They seemed to view my knowledge of their operations as creating ongoing obligations that prevented me from simply walking away. I never determined the full scope of the trafficking operation or what happened to the people whose profiles I had been communicating with through the private dating networks. The combination of sophisticated recruitment methods, comprehensive surveillance capabilities, and systematic exploitation suggested an organization with significant resources and reach. What I understand now is that they had developed effective methods for recruiting unwitting participants in human trafficking operations by exploiting people's loneliness and relationship desires. They understood how to use legitimate-seeming dating services to recruit both victims and accomplices for criminal activities. The most disturbing aspect of this experience was how my desire for companionship had been transformed into participation in the systematic exploitation of vulnerable people who were probably as lonely and desperate as I had been. The dating service had been designed to identify and recruit people whose emotional vulnerabilities could be leveraged for criminal purposes. I still receive occasional contact attempts from similar dating consultants and relationship coaches, offering guaranteed results and access to exclusive dating networks that aren't available through mainstream platforms. The services they describe always promise comprehensive background verification, always require confidentiality agreements, and always involve accessing private networks through specialized software. I decline these opportunities immediately now, but I wonder how many other lonely people have found themselves in similar situations, believing they are seeking genuine romantic connections, while actually participating in communication with trafficking victims or being assessed for recruitment into criminal operations themselves. I kept the old laptop because it felt rude to chuck it in the skip the same day I got it. That's the honest reason. Not curiosity, not nostalgia, just a small, misplaced guilt at holding a stranger's life in my hands for a moment and deciding it wasn't worth the space. I'd picked it up from a house clearance on a quiet street near Reading. The man running the sale told me it had been left under a bed with a tangle of charging leads. The battery didn't hold, the casing was scuffed, and the keyboard had that shiny patch in the center that tells you someone lived on it. I paid less than I would for a takeaway, took it home, and left it on a shelf where I keep the cables that don't fit anything I own. Weeks passed. I worked. I went for a run on the towpath. I saw the same faces at the corner shop. I cooked the same meals. The laptop sat where I'd put it, collecting a thin film of dust that never looks like dust until you move the thing and see the clean rectangle underneath. One wet Saturday, with rain ticking the window and nothing good on, I plugged it in. The boot took forever, the fan sounded like a small Hoover, and the desktop appeared with that familiar spread of icons drifted across the screen, like birds settled on a wire. It wasn't locked. Whoever had owned it hadn't expected anyone else to bother. There were the usual detritus, photos of people I didn't know at places I hadn't been, half-finished spreadsheets, a PDF of an instruction manual for a bread maker. There was a folder with one of those generic names, only numbers, last opened months before. Inside it were plain text files, no fancy titles, just lists with jumbled letters and dots. I clicked one. It was a set of addresses I didn't recognize. The file names didn't say anything helpful. Another text file had a handful of notes in clipped phrases, each one referencing those addresses. I recognized the general shape, though I'd never done more than read about it on the normal web. It was clear enough what they were meant for. Hidden places, not indexed by search engines, accessed by people who preferred a door that didn't open onto the street. I should have closed it there. I've read the stories like everyone else. I've heard the warnings. I'm not an expert and never wanted to be. I tell you this so you understand that when I scrolled through those lists and found a label that simply said cameras, it wasn't bravado. It was the same impulse that makes you prod a bruise to see if it still hurts. I didn't install anything clever. I didn't buy anything. I just used what was already there because whoever had owned the laptop had already done the work. A window opened, black background, thin columns, a set of small rectangles arranged like a contact sheet. Most were dark. Some showed lifeless rooms, as if waiting for actors who had never turned up. I clicked one at random. A kitchen appeared, a narrow room with a cheap blind pulled down halfway, a saucepan left to dry, a notice board with dull pins pressed in a crooked line. It could have been anywhere. I clicked another. A stairwell, no movement, just the faint ripple of compression artifacts when the light shifted. Boredom started to edge out the guilt. Then I clicked a feed that looked like it had been framed by someone who knew what they were doing. A bedroom this time. A man lay on top of the covers, trousers still on, shoes kicked off to one side. The camera seemed to be set high, near the ceiling, angled slightly down. There was a small lag between frames, a jerkiness that made the whole scene feel like a body in shallow water. The man's chest rose and fell. Nothing happened. After a while, my eyes went to the little elements. The folded clothes on a chair, the cheap clock on the bedside table, the pile of posts near the door. Normality layered up until it felt heavy. I clicked away before I could start inventing reasons for the existence of the feed. I told myself it could be a security setup someone hadn't protected properly. I told myself people put all sorts of things online without understanding the risks. I told myself the old owners had bookmarked it out of curiosity too. I closed the window and put the kettle on and thought about making something comforting, and that should have been the end. It wasn't. The next evening, after work, I opened the same folder and clicked again. The grid came back, rearranged slightly, as if someone had nudged it while my back was turned. I went looking for the bedroom. It wasn't there. I found a hallway instead, a skinny corridor with a runner rug and a bent umbrella in a stand. I only looked because I thought I recognized the pattern on the rug, a standard repeating shape you can buy anywhere. I leaned in, squinted a bit, and caught sight of a framed print further down the hall. A seaside scene, chalk cliffs and a small boat. It wasn't the same as mine, but it felt similar enough that my stomach gave that small, pointless twist of recognition. The angle was from one corner of the ceiling again. A steady eye, patient, never blinking. Nothing moved. I slept badly. Rain again. Wind testing the old sash window. The kind of night where you wake because the house creaks like a half-set cake. In the morning, nothing felt different, and I told myself I had imagined the unease. At lunch, while stirring something in a pan, I glanced at my own hallway. I'd always hated the bulb there. It flickered sometimes and needed a firm touch. The runner rug, however, had always been reliable. As I looked, I noticed that it sat a fraction further from the skirting than usual. Not a gap you'd measure, just a change from memory. I couldn't decide if I was inventing that too. I pushed it back with my foot and went back to eating. And that small domestic act felt like a reassurance. The third night, I didn't go looking for the grid. I watched something trivial, answered a message from a friend, read an article about a long case that had finally gone to court. I went to bed early and slept late. When I woke, a thin envelope had been pushed through my letterbox. It had no return address. The paper had that smooth, expensive finish used by people who don't want their fingerprint to hang on. Inside, there was a single sheet. No letterhead, no greeting. Just a short line of instruction, printed from a computer, stating the room where I should place a camera and the corner it should face. I won't write the exact words. I can still see them in my mind, and I think spelling them out would give them weight again. There was also a small plastic packet with a camera no bigger than a shirt button, adhesive on the back, a cable coiled neat as a snake in cold weather. It wasn't the best you can buy, but it didn't need to be. People talk about the moment something in your life scrapes over a concealed edge. They make it sound like a dramatic cut. In my experience, it's quieter. You stand in your hallway in a dressing gown with sleep crust in your eyes and a cheap envelope in your hand, and your mind begins the slow work of two opposing tasks at once, fighting to explain it away and cataloguing the details you will later recall to prove to yourself it was real. I walked into the living room, put the packet on the table, and made tea. The kettle wobbled slightly on its base because I'd never bothered to straighten the counter. My hands didn't shake. I drank the tea, then put the camera in my desk drawer and went out. I took a long route into town along the river, passing dog walkers and joggers and people pushing prams. I watched them move and tried to feel connected to the ordinary momentum of things. In a charity shop, I bought a lamp for the corner of my hall that had always been dim. At a small independent cafe, I paid for a coffee and drank it too hot, burning the tip of my tongue. I felt normal. It lasted just long enough to let me believe I'd done something sensible by stepping outside. When I got back, the envelope I'd left on the table had gone. The camera was still in the drawer. The note had been lifted out and taken. I checked the floor around the table, under the sofa, between the pages of a magazine. Nothing. I walked into the hall. The new lamp sat where I'd left it. The runner rug had shifted again. I didn't call anyone. I had the classic reasons not to. Embarrassment at being tricked by something that might still be a prank. Uncertainty that I could explain the full picture without sounding like I'd created it for myself. The small but not insignificant worry that I had been careless somehow, and this was the correction. I spent the evening in the living room with the TV on, volume a notch higher than usual, watching a program about renovation disasters. When I finally looked at my desk, the drawer was slightly open. The camera was gone. I didn't sleep in the bedroom that night. I lay on the sofa with a blanket and kept the lamp on. Every hour or so, I got up and stood in the hall, listening to the quiet of the building. Old pipes hum in particular ways when someone runs water, even if you don't know who. I heard the small shifts of the fabric of the place and grew fond of them because they weren't footsteps. At some dark half hour, I caught sight of movement on the edges of my vision, not inside the flat, but on the street outside the frosted glass of the door. A shadow passing left to right, another going the other way, slow enough to be purposeful, quick enough to finish before I could pin it to a person. The rational explanation is what I clung to. Foxes, neighbors, the beam of a passing car. I held that like a coin in my fist. Morning came with that tired grayness that makes even clean rooms look dirty. I opened my laptop, not the old one, and started typing an email I had no intention of sending. I described, in plain terms, the sequence of events, giving myself a record that proved I had noticed something wrong. Then I opened the old laptop again. The list of addresses was where I'd left it. One of the text files at the bottom had a new timestamp. I clicked it. There was a line, short, the kind of thing someone would write if they wanted to make a point without saying much. It referenced my hallway. It referenced the lamp I'd bought. It included a time that was close enough to make me swallow hard and sit back in my chair. I clicked the grid. The rectangles pulsed into life. Some remained black. Others showed rooms that could have been anywhere. In the top corner, a feed opened automatically. I saw my hallway, the frame wide enough to include the front door and the runner rug and the new lamp, which was switched on even though it was daylight, because I hadn't got round to plugging it into the switch socket. The camera angle was from high near the ceiling, very similar to the others I had seen, which meant it had been placed to match a house style. The quality was just good enough to remove doubt. Every scuff on the skirting board looked familiar. My shoes sat in a heap, one on its side. The tiny scrape on the door frame where a delivery once took a chip out of the paint showed as a bright slash of lighter wood. I watched myself enter the frame in a recording from earlier that morning. I wore the same clothes I had on. The timestamp in the corner of the feed was in a format I recognized, roughly accurate to real time. I saw myself pause, tilt my head, look down at the rug, then turn out of shot. Nothing else happened. The feed cut to live. Empty hall. A strip of daylight at the base of the door. I shut the laptop and unplugged it without bothering to close anything down. The room felt too small. The window felt too open. I thought about ripping the place apart until I found the camera. But I knew there wasn't one. Not the one I'd had anyway. That had been a test. A measure of compliance or defiance I couldn't tell. Whoever had planned this had planned for both. I took my phone and keys and left for a drive with no destination. I put the radio on and let voices I didn't care about fill the car while I circled the ring road and then cut out into a string of villages where nothing had changed for years. The sort of places where you can park by a green and listen to the wind knocking the last leaves off a line of trees. I came home when I thought enough time had passed to make me feel like I had regained the initiative. The flat smelled faintly of the candle I'd lit the night before. The hallway looked just as it should. I stood with my back against the door and told myself, again, simple things. There had been an intrusion. It had happened without noise or obvious signs. It had been done by someone who didn't need to break anything to get what they wanted. I made a decision I believed was sensible. I packed a small bag and left. I didn't tell the neighbor I was going. I didn't tell anyone, in case later I wanted to pretend none of this had occurred. I booked a room at a cheap hotel near the motorway, the kind of anonymous place only ever halfway clean, and I took the stairs because small lifts make me imagine what I would do if they stopped. That night I didn't sleep well, but I slept. I woke to sunlight finding its way past heavy curtains and a breakfast tray outside the door that I hadn't ordered. There was a folded note on top of it. My name, written in an ordinary pen, with the kind of handwriting you'd never remember. Inside, there was a short line about the dark web and how people often have the wrong idea about who sets the terms. Then there was a link, not the kind you can click. It was the sort of address someone who already knew where to go would recognize. I didn't have my old laptop with me. I left the tray where it was and went for a walk around the vast car park, avoiding looking at the surveillance system on the hotel walls because I would only start imagining how many people ever check those recordings unless they're asked to. By this point, you might think the sensible thing would have been to walk into a police station. I can list the reasons I didn't as a way of confessing more than just fear. I had no direct threat I could point to, only a series of events that would sound like a man working himself into a state. I had a laptop that didn't belong to me, filled with content I had no right to access. I had an envelope with a note I no longer possessed. I had a recording of my own hallway that I could no longer show because I had unplugged the laptop and left it face down on my desk. When people say they didn't act because they thought it would make things worse, they often sound cowardly. I was cowardly. I also believed, perhaps wrongly, that whoever had been inside my flat would only want me to call and would plan for it. The next day, I went home, because life doesn't pause for the things you can't describe neatly. On the way, I stopped at a hardware shop and bought a handful of small items that add up to the appearance of control. New locks, wedges for the windows, tape I could use to mark the position of objects. I fitted the new lock myself with the instruction leaflet propped nearby. The process took longer than it should. The bolt sat stiff. The door didn't close cleanly unless I lifted it a fraction with my foot. None of it made me feel safer. It made me feel like I was re-entering a room where someone had been waiting behind a curtain the whole time, watching me rearrange furniture as if it mattered. I moved through the flat and did the forensic thing everyone does badly. I checked edges, hinges, undersides. I opened the back of pictures and found nothing. I ran my hand under the radiator and felt only dust and a lost bottle cap. In the bedroom, I stood in the center and tried to imagine where I would hide something, if my only instruction had been to keep it looking exactly as it had been. Because people notice big changes and rarely notice small ones. There are places in all homes that the eye glances off. The top of door frames, the space under the lip of furniture, the corner where ceiling meets wall near a light fitting. I stood on a chair and looked at each. I found nothing. I didn't go back to the old laptop. It sat where I'd left it, a blunt shape that had the presence of an animal at rest. I worked, cooked, slept with the bedroom door shut for the first time in years. Days passed without incident. I stopped expecting to see my hallway appear on a screen. I went out with friends and kept my phone face down. I opened the post carefully and made small piles that I then forgot to deal with. Life returned, at least on the surface, to something like normality. The second envelope arrived on a day I had forgotten the first. It was thicker. Inside were still images printed on decent paper, each one a freeze frame from the camera I had never found. The angle was the same. The timing spread over mornings and evenings, all mundane, all devoid of drama. In one, I lean down to tie my shoelace. In another, I carry in a bag of shopping with too many tins. In another, I hold the door open with my foot for longer than needed because I've misjudged the weight of something in my hand. The final image in the stack was of me standing in the hallway, looking up, eyes aimed at the top corner where the wall meets the ceiling. The caption, printed underneath, gave a new link. It mentioned a time, later that same day, for a live event. I could describe the thoughts that collided then. Anger at being played with. Shame at being watched looking so ordinary. A grim small part of me that wanted to see the thing through because curiosity and fear share a border. I waited. I did nothing that would look like preparation if anyone cared to judge me later. At the given time, I opened the old laptop and typed the address as it had been written. The familiar black window opened, the list of rectangles and the pulsing dim frames. The top left tile expanded of its own accord. My hallway appeared, live, with a thin strip of daylight at the base of the door like an artery under skin. A number in a corner counted up to indicate viewers. It rose and then leveled. It never reached anything impressive. I suppose I should be grateful for that. For a long minute, nothing happened. Then the letterbox lifted, casual as a hand testing bathwater. Something slid through. It wasn't an envelope this time or a note. It was a key. My chest went tight because I had changed the locks and I had the only copies. The key lay on the doormat, shiny with fresh edges. I didn't move. The laptop on the table made a fan noise, like breath getting faster. The letterbox lifted again, and another item slipped in. A small roll of tape. Then another. A packet of cable ties. Then a narrow strip of black cloth rolled tight. They landed in untidy order. A hand tapped the letterbox from outside, not knocking, just testing the flex, and withdrew. I don't know how long I sat without moving. Long enough for my legs to complain when I stood. On the screen, nothing shifted. I felt in that moment the exact weight of choice, because there are times when your actions may invite one outcome or another, and you are painfully aware that you are being asked to pick. I chose the simplest thing because I was frightened. I pulled the plug on the old laptop, shut it, and put it back on the shelf where I'd first left it. I left the items on the hall floor. I went into the kitchen and did something I could control. I washed up. I wiped the worktop and hung the towel up neatly and stood facing the sink until I could breathe without hearing my pulse. In the early hours, at the time when sleep weakens enough to let in small noises, I heard a faint scrape at the door. Not the letterbox this time. Then the dull push of weight against wood. Then silence. I lay on my side and counted my breaths until dawn. As if by making it to a certain number, I could cross into a place where decisions were easier. The morning light came mean and flat. When I opened the bedroom door, the hall looked exactly the same except for the small stack I'd left untouched. The key lay at the top with the clean confidence of a threat. I moved out that afternoon. I packed badly, left items I liked because I couldn't bear to turn my back on the door long enough to find them, and drove to a storage unit on the edge of town, where the people at the desk are cheerful in a way that makes you want to cry. I rented a unit and dragged in boxes until I could close the shutter and lock it with a padlock that felt sturdy in the hand. I booked another cheap hotel, not the same one, and sat on the bed and stared at the fake art on the wall until my vision went soft. I didn't go back. I arranged for an estate agent to collect the keys and meet prospective tenants. I told myself I had no duty to warn anyone because I had no proof to pass on. I told myself that if I was honest about the door and the lock and the standard of the fittings, I was doing the job I had to do. I moved into a different flat across town, a newer building with a buzzer that buzzed and lights that came on when you walked past. I sat on the floor the first night and listened to the hum of the fridge like it was a friendly voice. I didn't buy a runner rug for the hallway. I picked lamps that came with fixed shades. I lasted a week before I looked again. I'm ashamed to admit that it wasn't even a week of clean abstinence. I thought about it every evening. I imagined the grid of small rectangles and the live counter in the corner and the thin strip of daylight at the base of the door. I wondered if someone else had taken my place. I wondered if not looking was a kind of cruelty, because it meant refusing to witness what might be happening to another person without their consent. On a quiet night, I gave in. I opened the old laptop where I'd tucked it into the back of a cupboard. It took its time waking, like an animal pulled from hibernation. The folder opened to the same set of text files. One had a new timestamp again, and another line, simple as ever, that referenced my new road by name. The grid appeared, a different arrangement this time, a reshuffle that told me rooms are added and removed in a pattern I didn't want to understand. The top left tile opened. I saw a hallway I didn't recognize. Not mine, not the old flat. A different door, a different configuration, a different cheap print on the wall. There was nothing remarkable about it until a man entered the frame, holding a small roll of tape and a strip of black cloth, and bent to place them on the doormat with careful fingers. He looked straight up at the camera. I thought for a second that I knew him, and then I realized I was forcing a connection, because what mattered was the posture, not the face. He had the confidence of someone acting out a set of instructions they had learned by heart. I clicked around the grid, searching for any hint of my own new hallway. I didn't find it. I found a bathroom with a towel folded too neatly to be honest. I found a living room with a TV casting a faint blue light into an empty space. I found a garage with a bike hanging from a hook and a dark stain on the floor that could have been oil or anything else that stains concrete. Then I clicked on a feed that made my throat go tight, in a way I hadn't felt since I was a child and had fallen in a swimming pool. It was a bedroom. The angle was from high near the ceiling, the bed tidy, the duvet smooth. On the bedside table was a book I owned, the same edition with the same small tear near the spine from where I'd packed it badly. The only difference was the lamp. Mine had a different shade. Everything else matched with the kind of casual accuracy that made denial impossible. I closed the laptop and slid it into a bin bag with other things I didn't want to see anymore. I carried it to my car and drove to the tip on the edge of town, where men in fluorescent jackets point you towards the right skips with a wave that never looks bored. I dropped the bag into the container labeled small electricals and listened for the clatter of it landing against other people's discarded machines. It made a duller sound than I expected. I stood for a moment and looked at the mound of anonymous plastic and metal and thought about how many lives hide in such piles, silent until someone knows where to look. Back home, I did the small practical things a person can do. I taped paper over the corners of every room where ceiling met wall. I boxed up the books I had enjoyed and placed them in a cupboard and put different ones out as decoys, as if those invisible eyes cared about what I read. I set the alarm on my phone for odd intervals at night and got up to walk from room to room, putting my hand to the coolness of the glass, listening to the stairwell for the weight of a footfall that didn't belong to me. Nothing happened. Days ran into each other. I pushed the knowledge to the edges, a trick people learn for much heavier secrets than mine. Then, one evening, I opened my front door to an envelope on the mat, thicker than the last. I picked it up and carried it to the kitchen without opening it. My stomach felt leaden. I placed it on the table with care and made tea as if the ritual would armor me. When I finally slit it open with the back of a knife, a set of photographs slid out. A new hallway, not mine. The same style of shots, the same dull fluorescent wash of light. Each one ordered carefully in a sequence that built to a picture of a door opening from the inside. A hand holding the knob without showing the person attached to it. The last image was a still of a living room I recognized from the grid. The caption was a time set for later that night, and a single word, live. I didn't watch. I couldn't. I sat at my table with my phone in my hand and thought about calling a number that would result in me speaking to someone whose job is to take statements. I tried to frame my story in a way that would make sense to a person whose day had already been full. I couldn't find the right order for the pieces. I was ashamed of that too, that I could be so controlled by the fear of sounding ridiculous. When the time on the note passed, I noticed the quiet in a way that made the hum of the fridge sound intrusive. There are nights where the street outside seems to hold its breath, a pause that feels like the city turning its face away. I waited. I slept in the chair. I woke with a stiff neck and a mouth like old coins. The envelope still lay open on the table. I slid the photographs back inside and put them in a drawer. I have made small changes since then. I keep my living space simpler than I used to. I don't buy the kind of art that looks good on a camera. I don't save empty boxes for the day they might be useful. I carry cash more often than I used to and pay in coins at places that still accept them. Not because I think it will protect me from anything, but because the feel of metal in the hand is a small, honest pleasure you can't replicate with a card. I don't go looking for the grid. I don't pretend it has gone away. I hold both truths. Sometimes I stand with my back to the door, eyes on the top corners of the room, and talk silently to the part of myself that went looking in the first place. It doesn't answer. It never needed to. It only ever wanted to look. On some evenings, walking home along streets where yellow light pools in windows and families eat in rooms that look briefly theatrical from the pavement, I think about the person who owned that laptop before me. I imagine them sitting at a similar table, making the same choices, feeling the same small weight of decision that drags on the muscle behind the breastbone. I wonder if the lists on their machine were a resource they curated, a burden they couldn't shake, or a set of instructions handed to them like a tool. I don't dwell on it. I keep moving. I arrive at my building, press the buzzer, listen to the faint answer, and walk up the stairs with my keys ready. At my door, there is usually nothing lying in wait. Some evenings, there is a takeaway menu in a brochure that has never been, isn't, and won't be my style. A thickness that hides nothing but a discount voucher for a place that will close next year when the rent rises. Some evenings, there is a parcel for someone on the wrong floor, and I do the courteous thing and take it up. I have almost convinced myself that the envelope was a blip, an anomaly, a notch in the wood where a careless mover once banged a box against the frame and time smoothed the edge. Then, last week, I came home and saw a thin strip of light at the base of the door that wasn't mine. It should have been darkness, because I always switch off the hall light when I leave. I can hear my own steps in the stairwell and don't need to see them. The strip glowed faint and unwavering. It could have been a fault. It could have been the cheap timer switching on early. It could have been anything simple. I opened the door and stood on the threshold for a moment. The hall lamp was on. The runner rug I hadn't bought was missing because I had never bought it. The skirting board scuff was in the wrong place because this was not the same flat, not the same house. The change that mattered was smaller. The ceiling in the top corner had a tiny dimple, the kind you get when filler shrinks back a fraction after someone makes a hole and covers it too quickly. I stepped inside. I put down my keys. I didn't close the door fully. The small sounds of the building folded around me. The lights hummed. The fridge clicked. The city exhaled through the open window in the bedroom. I looked up at the corner, at the dimple no one else would notice, and I felt that quiet shift again. The concealed edge scraped, the floorboard taking weight. I stood under it for a time that would be hard to measure honestly. I was calm. I was matter of fact. I was also, in a very ordinary way, afraid. I haven't checked any grid since. I haven't searched for addresses. I haven't opened laptops that don't belong to me or typed in links printed on thick paper. I still walk along the river. I still buy coffee that burns my tongue because I never learn. I still go to the corner shop where the same faces nod with the same small politeness that makes English life bearable when you're trying to be invisible. I make dinner and eat it in silence and sometimes listen to the washing machine hum while I think about how many ordinary moments make up a life. When I switch off the lights at night, I always start with the hall. I stand in the doorway and look at the line where the ceiling meets the wall. The dimple is still there. It will fade over time. the way small marks do. I tell myself that if I was being watched, there would be signs more obvious than plaster that didn't settle quite right. I tell myself that it's just bad filling by a landlord in a hurry. I tell myself that the dark web thrives on people like me who go looking and then pretend not to see once they've found. All three things might be true. I've learned that truth stacks easily when you're tired. I sleep with the bedroom door open again now, because doors don't stop anything unless a person is the thing being stopped and chooses to stand behind one and hold it shut. I leave a glass of water on the bedside table and a book with its spine up. I keep my phone face down. When I wake at that thin hour before dawn and the building creaks in a way I still love, I look at the corner and see nothing move. I listen to the street outside. I breathe. I wait for the light. I get up and make tea. And that first sip is the same as it's always been, as close to peace as most of us get. I told you I wasn't proud of any of this. I told you it started small. I haven't told you the worst part because it isn't dramatic. It's as ordinary as the people who watch weather forecasts and tidy bedrooms and tape cables along a skirting board. It's the knowledge that somewhere, on a grid I will never open again, there is a small rectangle of my hallway that looks like every other hallway in the country. And sometimes, at degree times I no longer know, it pulses from black to live. It probably doesn't have a huge audience. It probably doesn't draw much attention at all. That's fine by me. I'm done with being seen. I go about my days and nights with my keys ready and my eyes on the corners. And I let the rest of the world get on with its business behind doors I no longer trust. Looking back, I can't pinpoint exactly when it started going wrong. There was the form, obviously, but that was just one afternoon last year, maybe the year before. Time blurs when you're trying to piece together how something ordinary turned into something else entirely. I think I filled it out on a Tuesday, or possibly a Wednesday. A medical form before a GP appointment. The sort of thing you do without really paying attention, because it seems so routine. Except I am fairly certain now that completing that form is why I had to move house. Why my name still appears on websites I'll never be able to access, and why I check over my shoulder every time I unlock my front door. I'm a secondary school art teacher in Norwich, been doing it for about 15 years now. I live alone in a small semi-detached house near the Ring Road, the kind of modest property that suits someone on a teacher's salary with no particular aspirations beyond comfort and convenience. My health has generally been good, nothing serious, just the usual minor ailments that require occasional GP visits. Last year, I started experiencing persistent back pain, the sort that develops gradually from years of standing at easels and bending over students' work. I eventually made an appointment with my GP surgery, a large practice that serves several thousand patients across the area. When I called to book, the receptionist mentioned I could save time by completing my medical history form online before the appointment, and she'd email me a link. The email arrived within a few hours. It looked entirely legitimate, with the surgery's logo and branding, professional formatting, all the hallmarks of official NHS correspondence. The link directed to what appeared to be the surgery's patient portal, asking me to log in with my NHS number and date of birth before completing the pre-appointment questionnaire. The form itself was comprehensive, more detailed than I'd expected, but not unreasonably so. It asked about my current symptoms, previous medical conditions, medications I was taking, allergies, family medical history, lifestyle factors like smoking and alcohol consumption. Standard questions, that any general practitioner would need answers to before making a diagnosis or prescribing treatment. Then it asked for information I found slightly odd, but not alarming enough to stop. My home address, obviously, but also details about who I lived with, whether I had family nearby, what my work schedule was like, whether I had any upcoming travel plans. The form explained this was necessary for prescription delivery services and to ensure continuity of care if I needed follow-up appointments. There were questions about my daily routine, what time I typically woke up when I left for work, whether I had regular commitments in the evenings. The form said this helped them schedule appointments at convenient times and plan for home visits if needed. It made enough sense that I answered honestly, noting that I usually left home around 7:30 on weekdays, that I had a pottery class on Tuesday evenings, that I was generally home by 5 on most days. The final section asked about my security arrangements at home. Did I have someone who could collect prescriptions if I wasn't available? Would I be comfortable with medications being left in a secure location if I was out? Did I have concerns about package theft in my area? I mentioned I lived alone, that I didn't really have neighbors I knew well enough to collect things for me, and that packages were usually safe if left by my back door since it wasn't visible from the street. I submitted the form feeling I'd been thorough and helpful, exactly the sort of engaged patient that surgeries appreciate. The confirmation message thanked me for completing the questionnaire and said my information had been added to my medical records ahead of my appointment. When I attended the appointment 3 days later, I mentioned the online form to the doctor. She looked confused and said that they didn't have any record of me completing a pre-appointment questionnaire. She checked my file on her computer and confirmed that there was nothing new added since my last visit 18 months earlier. When I showed her the email on my phone, she immediately called the practice manager. The practice manager explained that they didn't send pre-appointment forms via email. Their patient portal existed but required in-person registration with photo ID, and they certainly didn't ask patients to complete medical histories online. The email I'd received was fake, designed to look like official surgery correspondence, but actually sent by someone with no connection to the practice. They took copies of the email and the form link, saying they'd report it to NHS security and the police. They'd seen similar scams before, usually fishing for personal information that could be used for identity theft or insurance fraud. They advised me to monitor my credit and watch for any unusual activity, but they seemed to think it was a relatively standard phishing attempt. I changed my passwords and kept an eye on my bank accounts, but nothing unusual happened immediately. No fraudulent transactions, no attempts to open credit in my name, no suspicious activity at all. After a few months, I largely forgot about the incident, assuming I'd been lucky to catch it before any real damage was done. Then, about 6 months after I'd completed that fake medical form, my house was broken into on a Tuesday evening whilst I was at my pottery class. The burglars had entered through my back door. The one I'd mentioned wasn't visible from the street. They'd taken electronics, some jewelry, and prescription medications from my bathroom cabinet. The police noted it was a clean, professional job with no forced entry, suggesting they'd picked the lock or had a key. The timing felt unfortunate, but not impossible. Tuesday evenings when I was reliably away, a back entrance that offered privacy from neighbors and passers-by. The police suggested it might have been someone who'd been watching the house, learning my routine before striking. They took a report, but were honest about the low likelihood of recovering my belongings or identifying the perpetrators. I upgraded my locks and tried to move on, though I felt violated in a way that lingered uncomfortably. About 3 months later, my house was broken into again, this time on a Thursday afternoon during school hours. Same method of entry, same careful selection of valuable items, same lack of evidence or witnesses. The police agreed it seemed targeted, but they couldn't identify any obvious connection to me or reason someone would specifically be focusing on my property. Then I started receiving strange deliveries, packages I hadn't ordered, addressed to me but containing items I'd never purchased. Medications, mostly. Things like painkillers and sleeping tablets, ordered from online pharmacies I'd never heard of. The quantities weren't large enough to be obviously criminal, just enough to seem like legitimate personal orders that might have been made by someone with my name and address. When I contacted the pharmacies to explain the orders weren't mine, they showed me account details created in my name using my NHS number and date of birth. The accounts had been active for months, placing regular small orders for various medications, all delivered to my address during times when I was reliably away from home. Someone had been collecting these packages, presumably during the break-ins or other occasions when they'd accessed my property without me knowing. The police investigation became more serious when they connected the fake medical form to the break-ins and fraudulent medication orders. The form had provided everything needed to target my home effectively. My routine, my security vulnerabilities, my medical information that could be used to order prescriptions in my name. Someone had designed a comprehensive intelligence gathering operation disguised as routine healthcare administration. A detective who specialized in organized crime explained that these schemes were increasingly common. Criminals would send fake medical forms to patients at various GP surgeries, collecting detailed information about their lives under the guise of healthcare efficiency. The information was then compiled into profiles that could be used for various purposes, from straightforward burglary to more complex prescription fraud operations. The detective showed me how to access a dark web marketplace where these patient profiles were being sold. My information was listed there, categorized under residential targets in the Norwich area. The listing included everything I'd put on that form: my address, my daily routine, details about my back door's location, information about my living situation and lack of nearby family, even notes about my upcoming travel plans that I'd mentioned on the form. But it also included my medical information, current health concerns, medications I was taking, details about my prescriptive needs that could be used to order medications in my name. The profile was marked as particularly valuable because it combined residential access information with medical data, making it useful for both burglary and prescription fraud operations. The marketplace listing showed my profile had been purchased multiple times. The burglars who'd broken into my house had probably bought access to information about my routine and security vulnerabilities. The people ordering medications in my name had purchased my medical details and prescription history. Different criminals using different aspects of the same comprehensive profile I'd unknowingly created by filling out that fake form. Comments beneath my listing discussed the accuracy and usefulness of the information. Previous buyers had left feedback confirming that my routine was reliable, that the back door access was easy, that the medication orders processed successfully. It read like product reviews on any commercial website, except the product being reviewed was detailed instructions for violating my privacy and committing fraud in my name. The investigation revealed that the scam had targeted thousands of patients across the east of England. The fake emails were sent to people who'd recently booked GP appointments, suggesting the criminals had access to surgery scheduling systems or had found ways to identify patients who'd be expecting medical correspondence. The forms were sophisticated enough that most recipients assumed they were legitimate, especially when they arrived around the same time as genuine appointment confirmations. The collected information was organized into detailed profiles and sold on multiple dark web marketplaces. Some profiles were purchased by burglary operations, others by prescription fraud networks, others by people interested in identity theft or insurance fraud. The same data could be sold repeatedly to different buyers, generating ongoing income from a single initial contact with the victim. What made it particularly insidious was how the medical context encouraged detailed honesty. People completing healthcare forms tend to provide accurate information because they understand that medical treatment depends on doctors having complete knowledge. The criminals had weaponized that instinct for honest disclosure, using medical authority to gather intelligence that had nothing to do with healthcare. The police arrested several people involved in the burglary and prescription fraud operations that had targeted my home, but they never identified who'd created and sent the fake medical forms or who managed the dark web marketplaces where the profiles were sold. Those aspects of the operation remained anonymous and untraceable, presumably continuing to function even after the downstream criminal activities were disrupted. I moved house about a year after discovering my profile on that marketplace. I couldn't stay somewhere that had been so thoroughly analyzed and repeatedly violated. My new GP surgery requires in-person verification for everything. No online forms, no emailed links, nothing that could potentially be intercepted or faked. I'm hypervigilant about any medical correspondence I receive, checking directly with the surgery before clicking links or providing information. But the profile still exists somewhere online. My old address, my routine from that period, my medical information from when I completed that form. It's been marked as outdated since I moved, but it's still available for reference, still being viewed by people planning similar operations against other targets. The information never truly disappears from these marketplaces. It just becomes less current and slightly less valuable. The prescription fraud continues to be a problem even after moving. Pharmacies occasionally contact me about suspicious orders placed in my name, using information that was harvested from that original fake form. My NHS number and medical details are presumably still circulating in criminal networks, still being used to place orders that I have to dispute and explain. The administrative burden of constantly monitoring for fraudulent activity has become a permanent part of my life. What haunts me most is thinking about how many other people filled out similar forms, never discovering they weren't legitimate, never connecting later break-ins or fraud to that initial medical questionnaire. The operation was designed to be subtle enough that most victims would never realize what had happened or how their information had been collected and used. I've tried to warn other teachers at my school, explaining what happened and encouraging them to verify any medical correspondence before responding. Some take it seriously, but others seem to think I'm overreacting or being paranoid. They can't imagine that something as mundane as a pre-appointment form could be part of such a comprehensive criminal operation. They're wrong, though. That's precisely what makes these scams effective. They exploit ordinary administrative processes that people encounter regularly and have learned to trust. A medical form seems inherently legitimate because we're conditioned to expect healthcare systems to gather detailed personal information. Questioning whether a form is genuine feels almost paranoid when it arrives at exactly the time you'd expect such correspondence. The fake form I completed looked professional, asked reasonable questions, and arrived when I was anticipating medical correspondence. Every aspect was designed to prevent skepticism, to encourage the kind of detailed, honest responses that would create a valuable criminal intelligence profile. And it worked perfectly, because I had no reason to suspect that routine healthcare administration could be weaponized so effectively. I still teach art, still live in Norwich, still deal with occasional back pain that started this whole situation. but I am fundamentally changed by understanding how easily medical trust can be exploited. How much damage can be done with information that seems innocuous when you're providing it. Every form I complete now, every bit of information I share, I question whether it's actually necessary and who might ultimately have access to it. The detective who handled my case told me these medical form scams were among the most effective intelligence-gathering operations she'd encountered. People's instinct to be honest and thorough when dealing with healthcare made them willing to provide information they'd never share in other contexts. The medical framing bypassed normal privacy concerns, encouraging disclosure that would seem inappropriate in any other setting. That's what I think about now when I receive medical correspondence. Not just whether it's legitimate, but what information I'm providing even when it is. How much detail do I actually need to share? Who will have access to what I disclose? Could this information be used for purposes beyond medical care if it fell into the wrong hands? These aren't questions I should have to ask about routine healthcare administration, but they're questions I can't avoid after experiencing what happened. My medical information became a commodity traded on criminal marketplaces. My routine became a product sold to burglars. My privacy became a resource extracted and exploited by people I'll never identify. The form took 15 minutes to complete. Just 15 minutes of answering questions that seemed entirely reasonable at the time. And those 15 minutes created a comprehensive profile that has been used against me repeatedly over the past 2 years. That still exists somewhere online. That still generates consequences I'm discovering gradually as new fraudulent activities appear. I filled out a medical form online, and that single act of trying to be a helpful, engaged patient led to break-ins, fraud, violation, and ultimately having to rebuild my life more carefully and suspiciously than before. That's the reality I live with now. Not dramatic trauma, but persistent awareness that routine administrative processes can hide sophisticated criminal operations, and that information freely given can become a weapon used against you in ways you'll never fully understand or control. I always thought dating apps were meant to help you meet people, not to reveal that someone had been stealing your photographs to lure strangers into something far darker than a bad date. When my divorce finally came through, I figured I'd give online dating a try. I wasn't looking for anything serious, just a few drinks here and there, maybe some company that wasn't my ex-husband's solicitor, or the checkout woman at Sainsbury's who'd started recognizing me from my daily wine habit. Setting up the profile felt weird enough, choosing photos that made me look attractive, but not desperate. Writing a description that seemed interesting without revealing too much personal information. The whole process made me feel like I was marketing myself, which I suppose is exactly what online dating is. I used a few recent photos that friends had said were flattering, mentioned my job as a primary school teaching assistant in Leicester, and listed some basic interests that might appeal to potential matches. I didn't reveal too much, but I did enough to give people a sense of who I was. The matches started coming through within hours, which was flattering even though most seemed to be men, whose profiles suggested they hadn't read mine properly. I encountered the typical group of individuals seeking relationships, some who demonstrated genuine interest in dialogue, and a handful who made me thankful for the instant blocking feature. After a week of disappointing coffee dates and text conversations that went nowhere, I noticed something odd when I searched my own name online out of curiosity. There were references to me on websites I'd never visited, using photos that were clearly mine but attached to profiles I hadn't created. I came across dating sites, social media platforms, and even what seemed like classified advertisements for services I had never provided. Someone had taken my photos and personal information from my legitimate dating profile and was using them to create fake accounts across multiple platforms for purposes that went well beyond simple catfishing. Some of the fake profiles presented me as someone offering companionship services that were clearly more than casual dating. Others suggested I was available for various types of personal assistance that seemed designed to attract people with specific requirements that normal dating sites wouldn't accommodate. But most disturbing were profiles on platforms I'd never heard of, using my photos and information to advertise what appeared to be specialized services for people whose interests couldn't be discussed on mainstream websites. I tried to research some of these platforms and found they were accessible only through specific methods that required technical knowledge I didn't possess. People arrange various types of transactions and services on hidden websites, maintaining anonymity and discretion. My photos and identity were being used to facilitate activities I knew nothing about, potentially putting me in danger from people who believed I'd agreed to arrangements I'd never consented to participate in. When I tried to contact the dating app where I'd originally posted my profile, their customer service was unhelpful beyond suggesting I enable additional privacy settings and consider changing my photos to prevent further unauthorized use. But the damage was already done. My images and information were circulating through networks that were designed to be difficult to trace or remove, and I had no way of knowing how extensively they'd been distributed or what purposes they were being used for. I hired a company that specialized in removing personal information from the internet, hoping they could eliminate the fake profiles and prevent further misuse of my identity. But the process revealed that the problem was much larger than I'd initially realized. My information had been systematically harvested and distributed through multiple networks that specialized in creating false identities for people who needed them for various illegal activities. The fake dating profiles were just the visible surface of an operation that created comprehensive false personas using stolen photos and personal information from legitimate dating sites and social media platforms. These false identities were then sold or provided to people who needed convincing backgrounds for criminal activities, fraud schemes, or other purposes that required established online presence and credible personal histories. The removal company explained that this type of identity theft was increasingly common, with criminal organizations systematically harvesting information from dating sites to create databases of false identities that could be used for various illegal purposes. People seeking legitimate romantic connections were unknowingly providing criminals with everything needed to impersonate them in contexts that could result in serious legal and personal consequences for the identity theft victims. But the most concerning part was that the fake profiles were used for more than just fraud. Some appeared to be facilitating arrangements that could put both the criminals using my identity and potentially me in physical danger. People who believed they were communicating with me through these fake profiles might eventually attempt to contact me directly, expecting to participate in arrangements I'd never agreed to and knew nothing about. The identity theft that began with someone stealing photos from my dating profile evolved into systematic impersonation, which could lead to dangerous people showing up at my home or workplace, believing I owed them services or cooperation promised through fake accounts. I realized that online dating had made me vulnerable, not just to romantic disappointment, but to criminal exploitation that could have serious consequences for my safety and reputation. The personal information that dating sites encouraged users to share was being systematically harvested by people who understood how to monetize stolen identities through networks that operated outside normal law enforcement oversight. Meanwhile, other people were probably experiencing similar identity theft through dating platforms. with their photos and information being used to facilitate criminal activities while they remained unaware of the ongoing misuse of their personal details. The removal company's efforts were only partially successful, managing to eliminate some fake profiles while others remained active on platforms that were inaccessible through normal reporting procedures. I was forced to change my phone number, increase security around my home address, and constantly monitor for new instances of identity theft that continued appearing, despite my efforts to prevent further misuse. The dating experience that was supposed to help me meet someone compatible had instead made me a target for ongoing criminal exploitation that affected every aspect of my daily life. But the most disturbing realization was that the people behind these identity theft operations were probably continuing to harvest information from dating sites, with new victims being added to their databases every day through platforms that encourage people to share exactly the types of personal details that were most valuable for creating convincing false identities. Every person who created an online dating profile was potentially providing criminals with the raw materials needed to impersonate them for purposes they would never willingly support, while believing they were just trying to find companionship through legitimate social platforms. The cycle of identity harvesting and criminal impersonation was probably accelerating as more people turned to online dating, providing an ever-expanding supply of personal information that could be exploited by people who understood how to monetize stolen identities through hidden networks. When I eventually gave up on online dating entirely, I discovered that simply deleting my profile wasn't sufficient to prevent continued harvesting of my information, since the original data had already been copied and distributed through systems designed to preserve and reuse stolen personal details indefinitely. My hands still shake sometimes when I think about all the conversations I translated, all the messages I helped people understand when they couldn't communicate with each other directly. I'm in a youth hostel in Durham at the moment. Strange choice for someone my age, but they don't ask many questions, and you can pay by the week if you help with the cleaning. There's a Polish girl working here who keeps trying to practice her English with me, and every time she asks me to help her with a difficult phrase, I feel physically sick, because translation work used to be how I made my living. I was a freelance interpreter for nearly 20 years, mostly doing remote work for businesses that needed help with European languages, especially Polish and Romanian. Then, the agency I worked through lost most of their contracts to cheaper overseas services, and I had to find other clients quickly. That's when I started taking translation jobs from people who wouldn't use mainstream services. People who needed communications interpreted that they couldn't risk going through official channels. I've had plenty of time these past few weeks to think about what I was really translating, what those carefully worded messages were actually arranging, and who was being hurt by the conversations I helped facilitate. I'd built up a good reputation over the years as a reliable interpreter. Nothing glamorous, mostly technical documents, business correspondence, the occasional video conference where participants needed real-time translation. The work was steady and paid well enough that I could afford a decent flat in Durham and didn't have to worry too much about money. The collapse happened gradually. First, a few regular clients stopped renewing their contracts. Then the agency reduced their rates to compete with overseas services. Then finally they let most of their UK-based interpreters go in favor of cheaper options abroad. I was 52 years old, with language skills that were suddenly worth half what they'd been the previous year. I spent several months taking whatever translation work I could find at increasingly desperate rates. Technical manuals that paid pennies per word, tourist guides that barely covered my rent, even some transcription work that didn't require my language skills at all. I was watching my savings disappear and wondering how much longer I could afford to stay in my flat. That's when I got the message through a freelancer website. Someone needed an experienced Polish-English interpreter for ongoing communication work that required absolute discretion. The rate they offered was exceptional, about 3 times what I'd been earning before the agency collapsed. They emphasized they needed someone reliable who could work with sensitive material and maintain strict confidentiality about the content of translations. The client, who identified himself as Mr. Walsh, explained during our initial phone conversation that he coordinated communications for business people who operated in areas where privacy was essential. Many of his clients conducted transactions that required confidentiality, and they needed interpreters who understood the importance of discretion and wouldn't ask uncomfortable questions about what was being discussed. I should have questioned what kind of business required such secretive translation services, should have wondered why legitimate companies wouldn't just use standard interpretation agencies. But Mr. Walsh was offering rates I couldn't afford to refuse, and I convinced myself that lots of businesses dealt with sensitive information that required privacy. The first assignment was straightforward enough. I was given a text message conversation between 2 people discussing what appeared to be a commercial transaction. One participant wrote in Polish, the other in English, and I provided real-time translations so they could communicate effectively. The conversation involved negotiating prices and delivery arrangements for unnamed goods, with both parties being careful to avoid specific details about what was being bought and sold. The vague language made me uncomfortable, but I told myself I was just facilitating communication, not endorsing whatever transaction they were arranging. My role was technical, providing accurate translation so people could understand each other, not moral or legal judgment about their business activities. Mr. Walsh was pleased with my work and immediately sent me more assignments. Over the following weeks, I translated dozens of conversations between Polish speakers and English speakers, all discussing commercial arrangements in deliberately vague language, quantities, prices, delivery schedules, but never specific details about what goods or services were actually being exchanged. The work fell into a comfortable routine. I'd receive notifications about new conversations that needed translation, provide real-time interpretation as messages appeared, and collect payment for the hours I'd worked. The money was keeping me financially stable for the first time since the agency had collapsed. But I started noticing elements of the conversations that troubled me. Some discussions included references to people rather than goods, talking about availability and suitability in ways that suggested they were arranging some sort of service rather than product delivery. Others mentioned timing that needed to coordinate with school schedules or work shifts, details that seemed unnecessarily specific for standard commercial transactions. When I raised concerns about the nature of what I was translating, Mr. Walsh explained that privacy-conscious businesses often used coded language to protect confidential information from potential competitors or regulatory oversight. My role was to translate the words accurately, not to interpret the underlying business purposes those words served. That rationalization let me continue accepting assignments without examining too closely what I was really facilitating. I was just an interpreter, providing technical translation services without responsibility for how parties used their ability to communicate with each other. The assignments became more disturbing over time. I found myself translating conversations that discussed people's routines, their vulnerabilities, their living situations. Discussions about the best approaches for making contact, techniques for establishing trust, even advice about circumventing security or supervision. I was translating what were obviously criminal conversations, but always with enough ambiguity that I could tell myself I didn't really understand the full context. Maybe these were private investigators conducting legitimate surveillance. Maybe they were security consultants testing vulnerabilities. Maybe there were innocent explanations I wasn't aware of. The breakthrough came when I translated a conversation that included a specific address in Durham. Two people were discussing someone who lived there when they'd be home alone, the best approach for gaining entry to the property. The Polish speaker was providing detailed instructions about security arrangements and optimal timing, while the English speaker confirmed they understood and would proceed as discussed. I recognized the address immediately. It was my neighbor's flat, just 2 doors down from where I lived. An elderly Polish woman who I'd occasionally help with her shopping or paperwork that required English comprehension. Someone had been surveilling her property and was now coordinating with an English speaker to exploit whatever they discovered about her vulnerabilities. I realized I'd been translating communications between criminals who were planning burglaries, harassment, possibly worse crimes against specific individuals. The deliberately vague language wasn't protecting legitimate business confidentiality. It was helping criminals coordinate their activities while maintaining plausible deniability about their intentions. I thought about all the other conversations I'd translated over the past few months, all the careful arrangements I'd helped people make about timing, approaches, vulnerabilities. Each translation I'd provided had probably enabled crimes against people who had no idea they were being discussed by strangers planning to victimize them. But what made it unbearable was understanding that my translation skills had been essential to these crimes. The Polish and English speakers couldn't communicate effectively without my interpretation, couldn't coordinate their criminal activities without someone bridging their language barrier. And I'd been that bridge, making it all possible through professional translation services. I tried warning my neighbor about the planned crime without revealing how I knew about it, but she didn't speak enough English to fully understand my concerns, and I didn't speak enough Polish to explain the specifics. The communication barrier that had made me valuable as a translator also prevented me from adequately warning the very person my translation work was targeting. 2 days later, her flat was burgled while she was visiting friends. The thieves had known exactly when she'd be gone and had targeted specific items she'd mentioned in conversations I'd translated months earlier. She'd been discussing her valuables with relatives in Poland, never knowing that someone was intercepting those conversations and using an interpreter to understand what she was saying. That's when I realized the full scope of what I'd been part of. I wasn't just translating conversations between criminals coordinating their activities. I was translating private communications between innocent people and their families, helping criminals understand conversations that were never meant for anyone else to hear. I started investigating the technical aspects of how I received translation assignments, trying to understand how Mr. Walsh was obtaining these conversations. What I discovered was that I was working with people who intercepted private communications between Polish speakers and their families or friends, then used interpreters like me to understand what was being discussed so they could identify opportunities for exploitation. The victims weren't willingly participating in conversations with criminals. They were having private discussions that were being secretly monitored and translated to identify vulnerabilities that could be exploited. Someone discussing their work schedule with family members might find themselves burgled during those specific hours. Someone mentioning health problems might be targeted by people offering fake medical services or financial assistance. I found records of hundreds of conversations I'd translated over the past few months, all between Polish speakers discussing their personal lives with people they trusted. Family conversations about daily routines, friends discussing concerns about security, elderly people talking with relatives about their health or finances, all intercepted and translated to identify people who could be targeted for various types of exploitation. Some conversations I translated had led to burglaries like the one targeting my neighbor. Others had enabled harassment campaigns against people who discussed fears or vulnerabilities with loved ones. A few had facilitated worse crimes that used intimate knowledge of people's lives obtained through intercepted and translated private conversations. But what disturbed me most was discovering that my translations weren't just enabling individual crimes. They were being sold to multiple people through hidden marketplaces, where criminals purchased intelligence about potential targets. The conversations I translated would be packaged with my interpretations and sold to anyone interested in targeting Polish speakers in specific areas or with particular vulnerabilities. I found marketplace listings offering translated intercepts organized by location, age group, and vulnerability type. My careful translations were presented as professional intelligence products that enabled efficient targeting of people who had no idea their private conversations had been compromised. One listing offered a package of translations I'd done involving elderly Polish women living alone in the Northeast, complete with my interpretations of their routines, health situations, and valuable possessions they'd mentioned to family members. Another focused on Polish families with young children, selling translated conversations that revealed school schedules, childcare arrangements, and times when children might be unsupervised. I was looking at evidence that my translation work had enabled systematic exploitation of vulnerable people, and that my professional skills had been weaponized to turn private conversations into commercial intelligence products sold to criminals. The worst part was understanding that the victims would never know how they'd been targeted. They'd been having private conversations in their native language, discussions they believed were secure because most people in the UK couldn't understand Polish. But I'd eliminated that security by providing professional translation services that made their private lives accessible to anyone willing to pay for the intelligence. My neighbor had been speaking Polish with her family members about the jewelry she'd inherited, never imagining that someone was translating those conversations to identify her as a burglary target. Other people I'd unwittingly helped victimize had discussed their fears, their routines, their vulnerabilities in Polish, believing they were safe because their conversations weren't in English. I'd destroyed that safety by providing the translation bridge that made their private lives understandable to criminals who treated non-English communications as an untapped resource for identifying potential targets. I tried contacting the police about what I'd discovered, but explaining my role without admitting extensive complicity proved impossible. I'd been translating intercepted communications for months. Accepting substantial payment for work I should have recognized wasn't legitimate. The translations I'd provided had enabled serious crimes against real people. The officer I spoke to was professional but frank. I'd knowingly worked with people intercepting private communications, providing translation services that enabled criminal activity. The fact that I claimed not to have fully understood what I was doing wouldn't protect me from prosecution for my role in systematic exploitation of vulnerable people. I was advised to stop translating immediately and refuse further contact with Mr. Walsh, but he'd already anticipated that possibility. I started receiving messages in Polish, obviously using a different interpreter now, warning me that people who cause problems would face serious consequences. The messages included details from my own private conversations, things I'd discussed with family and friends that I'd assumed were secure. They'd turned their interception and translation services on me, demonstrating that I was just as vulnerable as all the people whose conversations I'd been translating. Then I found my own details listed in the marketplace, where they sold translated intercepts. Someone had packaged information about my life, my routines, my vulnerabilities, all obtained through monitoring and translating my private communications. I was now a product in the same marketplace I'd been supplying with translations. That's when I left Durham entirely, abandoning my flat and most of my possessions to hide in this youth hostel where nobody knows my background or understands why someone my age is staying in budget accommodation meant for backpackers. But I know the interception and translation services continue without me. Other interpreters have probably been recruited to translate intercepted Polish communications. People who'll make the same rationalizations I did about just providing technical language services without responsibility for how their translations are used. The marketplace is probably still selling translated intercepts to criminals who use them to target vulnerable people. And somewhere in those listings, translations I provided months ago are probably still being purchased and used to enable crimes against people whose only mistake was having private conversations in a language they thought would protect them. I keep thinking about my neighbor, about all the other people whose private conversations I translated. Without understanding, I was betraying their trust and security. They'd been speaking Polish, believing it gave them privacy, never knowing that professional interpreters were being paid to eliminate that protection and make their private lives accessible to anyone willing to pay for the intelligence. The translation work taught me that language barriers can create false security, that speaking in your native language doesn't protect you if someone's willing to hire interpreters to understand what you're saying, that professional translation skills become weapons when applied to intercepted private communications, and that once you've spent months translating conversations you should have recognized weren't meant for you to interpret, you become too compromised to report it without facing prosecution for your role in enabling systematic exploitation. I suppose that's why I'm hiding in this youth hostel, rather than helping police shut down the interception and translation operation. Because I know my translations are documented evidence of my active participation in crimes against vulnerable people. And I'm not brave enough to face consequences for choices I made when professional satisfaction and financial need mattered more than questioning what my skills were really being used for. All I can do is hope that someone else will eventually expose these operations, that other interpreters will find courage I lack to report what they're translating despite personal cost, and hope that people whose private conversations I translated managed to stay safe despite the intelligence I helped create about their lives. Because the operations are still running, still recruiting interpreters, still intercepting private communications and selling translated intelligence to criminals. And I helped prove that professional translation services make interception more valuable, helped establish that non-English communications are exploitable resources, helped create an industry that treats people's private conversations as raw materials for criminal intelligence products. I just wish I could undo it all, could warn every person whose conversations I translated, could restore the security they thought they had when speaking in their native language. But I can't, so I just avoid the Polish girl who works here and try not to think about how my professional skills were weaponized against people who trusted that speaking Polish would keep their private lives private. "15 minutes of my time for a £20 voucher. It's the sort of thing you do on a slow afternoon without thinking twice. It seemed completely harmless, just a phone survey. Another bit of market research that companies are always conducting. Except those 15 minutes are the reason I had to move house, change my routine entirely, and now check over my shoulder every time I unlock my front door. I work as a florist in Exeter. running a small shop near the cathedral that's been in my family for 3 generations. It's modest but steady work, the sort of business that survives on repeat customers and word-of-mouth recommendations rather than any dramatic growth strategy. I'm there 6 days a week, usually opening around 8 in the morning and closing by 6 in the evening, with Sundays off for the market reset and personal time. About 2 years ago, I received a phone call at the shop from someone conducting what they described as a lifestyle survey for a consumer research company. The caller was professional and polite, explaining they were gathering data about shopping habits and daily routines to help businesses better understand their customers. The survey would take roughly 15 minutes, and I'd receive a £20 Amazon voucher for participating. I've always been somewhat skeptical of these types of calls, but this one seemed legitimate. The caller knew I owned a retail business, which suggested they'd done at least some research rather than cold calling randomly. They mentioned the name of a research firm I vaguely recognized from seeing referenced in business articles. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon with no customers in the shop, so I agreed to participate. The question started normally enough. What time did I typically open the shop? When was my busiest period during the day? What days was I closed? Did I work alone or have employees? Standard information that any market research company might collect about small business operations. Then the questions became more specific. What time did I usually leave home in the morning? Did I take the same route to work each day? Did I live alone or with family? What kind of security measures did I have at home? The caller explained these questions were about understanding work-life balance and security concerns for small business owners, which sounded reasonable enough at the time. I answered honestly, not really thinking about why a consumer research firm would need to know that I left home around 7:40 each morning, that I lived alone in a terraced house about 2 miles from the shop, that I had a fairly basic alarm system but no cameras, that I usually took Wednesdays slightly easier because foot traffic was lower midweek. The caller asked about my evening routine as well. What time did I typically get home? Did I go out during evenings or mostly stay in? Did I have neighbors who were usually around? Were there particular nights when I was reliably away from home? I mentioned that I went to a book club every other Thursday evening and usually did my weekly shop on Tuesday evenings after work. The survey concluded with questions about my holiday patterns. How often did I close the shop for holidays? Did I tend to go away during specific seasons? Who looked after my home when I was away? I explained that I typically closed for a week in August and a few days around Christmas, that I didn't usually travel far, and that my sister who lived nearby would check on my house when I was away. The whole conversation lasted around 20 minutes, and the caller thanked me professionally before ending the call. Within a few days, I received an email with a code for the promised Amazon voucher, which further confirmed the survey's legitimacy in my mind. I spent it on some gardening supplies and didn't think about the call again. Several months later, my house was broken into on a Thursday evening whilst I was at book club. The burglars took electronics, jewelry, and some cash I'd kept in a drawer. But they'd been careful and methodical. No forced entry that I could see initially, no mess or vandalism, just specific valuable items removed efficiently. The police suggested they'd picked the lock, which apparently wasn't difficult with the older style lock I had on my back door. The timing seemed like unfortunate coincidence. Thursday evenings when I was reliably away from home. A quiet residential street where people minded their own business. No security cameras to capture anyone entering or leaving. The police took a statement and gave me a crime reference number, but they were honest about the low likelihood of recovering my belongings or identifying who was responsible. I upgraded my security after that, installing better locks and a camera system that covered the front and back of the house. I felt violated, but tried to move on, telling myself it was random bad luck rather than anything targeted. Then it happened again, 4 months later, this time on a Tuesday evening whilst I was doing my weekly shop. Different items taken, same methodical approach, same lack of forced entry. The burglars had somehow bypassed my new alarm system, though the security company couldn't explain how. The cameras showed nothing because they'd been disabled before anyone appeared in frame, suggesting the intruders knew exactly where they were positioned. That's when I started to feel something was specifically wrong, rather than just unlucky. 2 break-ins within a few months, both occurring during times when I was reliably away from home. Both executed with enough knowledge of my property to avoid security measures. The police agreed it seemed targeted, but couldn't identify any obvious connection or suspect. I mentioned the incidents to several other shop owners in the area during a local business association meeting. 3 of them had experienced similar break-ins over the past year, all perfectly timed to occur when they were away from home. One woman's house had been burgled during her weekly choir practice. Another man's flat was broken into every Tuesday evening when he visited his mother in a care home. A third person had been burgled twice during his regular golf afternoons. What connected us all, we eventually realized, was that we'd each received similar phone calls about lifestyle surveys. Different callers, slightly different company names, but the same general pattern of questions about our daily routines, security measures, and when we were reliably away from home. We'd all received the promised vouchers afterwards, which had convinced us the surveys were legitimate. One of the business owners, a woman who ran a bookshop, was more technically minded than the rest of us. She suggested we try to find information about the research companies that had supposedly conducted these surveys. None of us could remember the exact names, but we had rough recollections and in some cases email addresses from the voucher codes we'd received. Every single company name we could recall came up empty when we searched online. No websites, no business registrations, no references in any professional marketing or research directories. The email addresses used to send the vouchers were from free email services, not professional company domains. We'd all been scammed, systematically questioned about our routines and security by people whose only purpose was gathering information for burglaries. The bookshop owner did more digging, eventually finding a discussion thread on an obscure security website where someone had posted about similar survey scams being used to coordinate break-ins. The thread mentioned that the information collected from these calls was being compiled and sold on the dark web, creating detailed profiles of potential burglary targets complete with their routines, security measures, and optimal times for break-ins. She showed me how to access the relevant part of the dark web, where these profiles were supposedly being traded, walking me through the process since I had no idea how any of it worked. It took some time to find the right marketplace, but eventually we located a section specifically dedicated to what they called residential access information. My address was listed there, along with dozens of others from Exeter and surrounding areas. The listing included everything I'd told that survey caller: my morning departure time, my Thursday evening book club, my Tuesday shopping trips, the location of my shop and typical working hours, details about my alarm system and the positions of my cameras, information about when I took holidays and who checked on my house when I was away. The profile had been updated since my initial survey call. Someone had added notes about the security upgrades I'd made after the first burglary, details about my new locks and camera positions, observations about which neighbors were usually home during certain hours. They'd been watching my house, documenting changes, keeping the information current to maintain its value to potential buyers. The listings included pricing structures based on the quality and detail of information provided. My profile was marked as premium because it contained verified information about security systems and regularly updated observations about my routine. The price for accessing my full profile was around £50, cheap enough to be impulse purchase for someone planning a burglary, but expensive enough to generate significant income when multiplied across hundreds of similar listings. Comments beneath my listing discussed the reliability of the information and the ease of access to my property. Previous buyers had left feedback like reviews on any commercial marketplace, rating how accurate the timing information was and whether the security details matched what they'd encountered. Several comments mentioned successful entries during my Thursday book club sessions and Tuesday shopping trips. I felt physically sick reading through it all, understanding that my home had been treated as a product, my routine analyzed and packaged for sale to criminals who viewed breaking into houses as a straightforward business transaction. The survey I'd answered so casually had created a detailed instruction manual for violating my privacy and stealing my belongings. The bookshop owner and I documented everything we found and brought it to the police. They took it seriously this time, involving detectives who specialized in organized crime. The investigation revealed that these survey scams were part of a much larger operation spanning multiple cities across the southwest of England. The people conducting the surveys worked for someone coordinating burglaries across the region. They'd target small business owners specifically because that demographic tended to have predictable routines, lived alone or with minimal family, and had possessions worth stealing but not enough wealth to afford extensive security systems. The surveys identified ideal targets and created detailed profiles that were then sold to burglary teams who specialized in quick, efficient break-ins. The operation had been running for several years, with hundreds of homes burgled based on information gathered through these fake surveys. The dark web marketplace, where the profiles were sold, had thousands of listings covering properties across the UK, all organized by region and ranked by the quality of information available. What made it particularly difficult to combat was that the survey callers were never directly involved in the actual burglaries. They just gathered information and passed it along to whoever managed the marketplace. The burglary teams purchased access to profiles without ever knowing who'd collected the information or how. Everyone involved had plausible deniability about the full scope of the operation. The police eventually arrested several people involved in the burglary teams, but they never identified who was conducting the surveys or who managed the dark web marketplace. The site was shut down temporarily, but apparently resurfaced under a different address within weeks. The model was too profitable and too difficult to police effectively. I moved house 6 months after discovering my profile on that marketplace. I couldn't stay somewhere that had been so thoroughly analyzed and categorized, knowing that even with security upgrades, the basic vulnerability of my routine had been permanently documented. My new address isn't listed yet, but I know that doesn't mean it won't be eventually. I'm hyper-vigilant about phone surveys now, refusing to participate in anything that asks about my routine or security measures. I've warned everyone I know about these scams, explaining how innocent-seeming market research questions can actually be intelligence gathering for criminal purposes. Some people take it seriously, but others think I'm being paranoid, that surely legitimate research companies also ask similar questions. They're right, of course. That's what makes these scams so effective. The questions seem reasonable, the callers sound professional, the promised compensation arrives as promised. Nothing about the interaction raises immediate red flags because it's designed to mimic legitimate market research. closely enough that most people never question it. The other business owners whose houses were burgled have had mixed experiences since discovering the marketplace. Some moved like I did, unable to feel safe in homes that had been profiled and traded online. Others stayed but invested heavily in security systems, though we all know that information about those systems is probably being gathered and updated somewhere. One person closed their business entirely, unable to maintain predictable hours, knowing that routine was precisely what made them vulnerable. The psychological impact has been worse than the financial losses from the burglaries themselves. It's the knowledge that strangers had studied my life in detail, that my daily patterns were documented and analyzed, that my home's vulnerabilities were mapped out and sold to whoever wanted to exploit them. The violation isn't just that people broke into my house, but that they were invited by information I provided willingly, never understanding how it would be used. I still think about that survey call sometimes, wishing I'd been more suspicious or less accommodating. But I know that's pointless. The operation was designed specifically to target people like me, people who run small businesses and answer phones professionally, people who are used to participating in legitimate market research as part of understanding their customer base. My mistake wasn't unique or particularly careless. It was predictable, and that's why the scam works so effectively. The marketplace listings continue circulating somewhere in the hidden corners of the internet. My old address is probably still there, marked as outdated but available for reference. The information never truly disappears. It just becomes less current, less valuable, but still potentially useful to someone planning a burglary in that neighborhood. I've developed new routines that are deliberately unpredictable. I vary my shopping times, skip book club occasionally, take random routes home from work. I never answer survey calls anymore, even ones that seem completely legitimate. I've installed security systems that I modify regularly so their configurations aren't static. I'm constantly aware that information about my routine has value to people with bad intentions, and that awareness has fundamentally changed how I live. The worst part is knowing how many other people are being surveyed right now, answering seemingly innocent questions about their daily patterns, providing detailed information about when they're home and when they're vulnerable. The operation I fell victim to was shut down, but others like it continue operating because the model is so effective and so difficult to trace. Every time I hear about a burglary in the area, I wonder if it was coordinated using information from another fake survey. Every time someone mentions participating in market research, I want to warn them about what those questions might really be gathering, but I also know that sounding too paranoid undermines the message, that most people won't believe these sophisticated scams exist until they experience them personally. That's the reality I live with now. Not the dramatic trauma of a violent crime, but the persistent unease of knowing my personal information was weaponized against me, that my willingness to be helpful was exploited by people who understood exactly which questions to ask and how to make them seem legitimate. The knowledge that somewhere online, detailed instructions for violating my former home are still available for purchase, and that similar instructions for countless other homes continue being compiled and traded by people I'll never identify. I answered a survey about my daily routine, and that single decision led to break-ins, violation, fear, and ultimately having to leave my home. That's what keeps me cautious now. What makes me question every request for information, no matter how innocent it seems. Because I've learned that the most effective violations are the ones you invite yourself, never realizing what you're actually providing until it's far too late to take it back. The orange orange glow from the sodium lights outside seeped through the gap in my cheap curtains, painting the grimy wall a sickly yellow. It was always there, a constant, dull throb against the night, much like the ache in my chest. Swindon, a town of roundabouts and endless grey skies, had become my cage. The hum of the nearby electrical substation vibrated through the floorboards, a low, persistent drone that had long since burrowed into my skull, a soundtrack to my quiet desperation. I was Martin, 34, and the sum total of my existence could be measured in the growing stack of overdue bills on my kitchen counter and the ever-present gnaw of a failed relationship that had left me with less than nothing. My fingers, stained faintly with the grease of a forgotten takeaway, hovered over the keyboard. The screen, a harsh blue rectangle in the gloom, displayed a website I'd stumbled upon a few weeks prior. It wasn't the usual eBay or Gumtree. This was different, darker, an echo of the internet's underbelly, whispering promises of easy money. Shadow Market, the banner proclaimed in a stark white font, a name that felt both illicit and alluring. I'd told myself it was just curiosity, a morbid fascination with the digital fringe. But the truth was, the bank statements didn't lie. My account balance was a flat line, and the prospect of a bailiff at my door was becoming less a fear and more an inevitability. The first item I bought was a tablet, sleek and black, advertised as barely used. The price had been absurdly low, a fraction of its retail cost. My rationalization then had been simple. Someone probably dropped it, damaged the box, and couldn't return it. A simple resale, a quick profit. I'd listed it on a mainstream site, added a modest markup, and it sold within hours. The surge of adrenaline, the satisfying ping of the notification, had been intoxicating. It wasn't much, but it was enough to cover a utility bill, a tiny reprieve from the suffocating pressure. This small success had opened a door. The website became my secret addiction, a clandestine marketplace where I could momentarily escape the reality of my failing life. I started small, a smartphone here, a smart speaker there, always cheap, always quick to sell. The money trickled in, enough to keep the wolves from the door, to buy another tasteless ready meal, to keep the electricity flowing. Each successful transaction, each anonymous buyer, chipped away at the thin veneer of my conscience. I wasn't stealing, I reasoned. I was just a middleman, an entrepreneur in a digital age, navigating the grey areas. The laptop I bought next was a high-end model, practically brand new, for a price that made my heart pound. It arrived in plain packaging, no discernible return address, just like all the others. I booted it up, planning to wipe it clean before reselling. But a flicker of curiosity, a rare indulgence, made me pause. The previous owner hadn't bothered to erase their files. A photo opened, a young woman smiling, her arm around a man with a booming laugh. They stood before a brightly painted carousel, their faces alight with joy. I felt a prickle of unease. It wasn't a family portrait, not exactly. It was a holiday snap, vibrant and full of life, a stark contrast to the sterile, anonymous transaction that had brought the machine to my desk. I quickly deleted the files, wiping the hard drive with a professional-grade program, telling myself it was simply good practice. No loose ends. Weeks bled into months, marked by the arrival of packages and the satisfying chime of payment notifications. My flat, once a shrine to my own melancholic isolation, began to fill with a transient inventory. Boxes stacked in corners, devices charging on every available surface, a silent testament to my burgeoning illicit enterprise. The hum from the substation seemed to grow louder, or perhaps it was just the ringing in my ears, a constant reminder of the tightrope I walked. Then came the tablet. It was another top-of-the-range model, still in its original sealed box, listed for an unbelievably low price. The seller's handle was a string of random characters, as most were, offering no clue to their identity. When it arrived, I noticed a small dent on one corner of the box, barely perceptible. Inside the tablet was pristine. I powered it on, intending to factory reset it immediately. But a lock screen appeared, displaying a wallpaper, a selfie of a young girl no older than 10, with bright, inquisitive eyes and a gap-toothed smile. Her name, Chloe, was emblazoned across the top of the screen in a playful, childish font. A cold dread began to seep into my bones. Chloe. The name resonated with a faint, unsettling familiarity. I'd seen it somewhere recently. My fingers trembled as I navigated to a news website typing Missing Persons UK into the search bar. The results flooded my screen. And there she was, Chloe Davies, missing from a small town in Wiltshire, just a few hours' drive from Swindon. Her photograph, identical to the one on the tablet's lock screen, stared back at me. The article spoke of a frantic search, heartbroken parents, and a police appeal for information. The air in my flat grew heavy, thick with unspoken accusations. The hum of the substation became a roaring in my ears. I felt a sudden, desperate urge to vomit. My pragmatism, my carefully constructed facade of a legitimate reseller, shattered. This wasn't just cheap electronics. This wasn't just a dodgy side hustle. This was something far, far worse. I remembered the laptop, the couple at the carousel. I remembered a smart watch I'd sold a week earlier, its fitness tracker still logged into an account under the name Mark. Mark Harrison, a man reported missing from Birmingham, his case widely publicized. I had dismissed it then, a mere coincidence, a trick of a tired mind. But now, the coincidences piled up, forming a gruesome tapestry of stolen lives, not just stolen goods. My hands shook, slick with a cold sweat, as I scrolled through the shadow market listings. Each item, once a potential source of income, now felt like a bloodied trophy. I saw a watch, a distinctive gold chain, a pair of custom-made headphones, each piece of hardware, a chilling breadcrumb leading back to a life abruptly interrupted. I was complicit. I was part of it. I had been moving evidence, unknowingly, for weeks. The thought made my stomach clench. I had to do something. My first instinct was to delete everything, to scrub my digital footprint clean. But that wouldn't erase what I'd done, what I'd seen. It wouldn't bring Chloe back. I stared at the tablet, Chloe's innocent face beaming at me from the screen. My fingers still trembling typed out an email to the police. It was anonymous, carefully worded, detailing how I'd come across the device, omitting any mention of shadow market, painting myself as an unwitting recipient. I provided the serial number, the details of Chloe's photo. Then I deleted the email, closed the browser, and disconnected the router. The silence that followed was deafening, a stark contrast to the constant hum that had filled my flat. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Sleep became a distant memory. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant siren sent a jolt of terror through me. I imagined them knocking on my door, their faces grim, their questions pointed. My carefully constructed world of self-deception had imploded, leaving me exposed and terrified. A week passed. No police, no arrests. No news reports linking my email to any breakthrough in Chloe's case. Had they dismissed it? Was my anonymous tip lost in the deluge of other, less credible leads? The uncertainty was a torment. I started to question my own sanity. Had I imagined the coincidences? Had my debt-ridden brain conjured a narrative of horror to justify my own failings? Then, an email arrived. It wasn't from the police. It was from one of my previous customers, a woman who had bought a digital camera from me months ago. The subject line read, "Regarding the camera." My blood ran cold. I opened it, my breath catching in my throat. "I need to speak to you urgently about the camera you sold me," the email began. "There are some unusual photos on it. Photos of places I recognize, and a face I recognize from the news." A cold, hard knot formed in my stomach. She had traced it back to me. How? I had always used burner emails, VPNs, and anonymous shipping labels. I had covered my tracks meticulously. Or so I thought. My phone rang. The number was blocked. I stared at it, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I didn't answer. It rang again, and again. The persistent buzzing was like a drill boring into my skull. I switched off my phone, pulling the plug from the router, plunging my flat into an even deeper digital silence. But the silence didn't bring peace. It brought a suffocating sense of impending doom. I was exposed. The anonymity I had so carefully cultivated had failed. The next few days were a blur of paranoia and fear. I barely ate, barely slept. Every shadow held a lurking threat. Every sound a potential harbinger of discovery. I peered through the gaps in my curtains, watching the car park below, half expecting to see a police car, a figure in a trench coat. My own reflection in the window seemed alien, gaunt, eyes wide with a terror I could no longer suppress. I knew I couldn't hide forever. The woman who had bought the camera, she knew. And if she knew, others could too. The network I had been a part of, the shadows I had moved through, were now closing in around me. The knock came just before dawn. 3 sharp, authoritative raps that echoed through the silence of my flat. My breath hitched. I froze, my heart thundering. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I just listened, straining for any sound, any clue. Another knock, louder this time. "Police!" A voice boomed from the other side of the door. "Open up, Mr. Davies." Mr. Davies. My name wasn't Davies. I felt a flicker of confusion, a tiny, fleeting moment of reprieve before the full weight of the situation crashed down on me again. They had the wrong name. Or did they? Had I been so careless? The door rattled as a heavy shoulder struck it. The cheap lock groaned in protest. I stumbled backward, my legs suddenly weak. This was it. The end of my quiet, desperate enterprise. The reckoning. I heard the splintering of wood, the sharp crack of the doorframe giving way. Figures in dark uniforms burst into my flat, their faces grim, their movements swift and precise. The beam of a powerful torch cut through the gloom, momentarily blinding me. "Martin Hayes," one of them demanded, his voice devoid of inflection. I could only nod, my throat dry, my tongue thick. "You're under arrest." They cuffed me, the cold metal biting into my wrists. I offered no resistance. What was the point? My life, my carefully constructed facade had crumbled. As they led me out past the scattered boxes, past the glowing embers of my laptop, I glanced back at the screen. It had powered itself on somehow, displaying the Shadow Market homepage. And there it was, a new listing, prominently displayed, a fresh face on the scrolling banner. My face, my own hollow-eyed face, staring out from the digital abyss. Below it, a chilling single word: available. The orange glow of the sodium light still seeped through the shattered doorway, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, a silent, swirling testament to the quiet complicity of survival and the moral erosion that had consumed me. The hum of the substation, for the first time, seemed to fade into a distant whisper, replaced by the deafening roar of my own terror. There's a video of me online that I never knew was being recorded, and finding it changed everything about how I understood my own life. I wish I could say I stumbled across it by accident, but the truth is, someone wanted me to find it. I'm a primary school teacher in Newcastle, have been for about 8 years now. It's demanding work, but I enjoy it. The sort of job where you finish each day exhausted, but feeling like you've actually done something worthwhile. I live alone in a one-bedroom flat near the city centre. Nothing fancy, but it's mine, and it's comfortable enough. Last autumn, I applied for a new position at a different school. Better pay, shorter commute, more opportunities for progression. The application process was standard enough. Online form, supporting statement, references from my current head teacher. I spent a couple of evenings getting everything together and submitted it through the council's recruitment portal. About a week later, I received an email asking me to complete an additional assessment. The message came from what appeared to be the council's HR department, using their official email domain and professional formatting. It explained that due to the high number of applicants, they'd introduced a new screening process involving a video interview that could be completed at home. The email included a link to a platform I hadn't heard of before, something called Teach Assess Pro. It looked legitimate enough, with a clean professional design and testimonials from other educational authorities. The instructions were straightforward. Answer 5 pre-recorded questions on camera, with 2 minutes to respond to each. Standard interview practice questions about classroom management and curriculum planning. I set up my laptop in the living room, made sure the lighting was decent, and completed the assessment. It felt slightly awkward talking to a camera rather than a real person, but I'd done similar things for other applications. The questions were exactly what I'd expected, and I felt reasonably confident about my responses. The platform confirmed my submission and said I'd hear back within 2 weeks about whether I'd been selected for a face-to-face interview. I thought nothing more about it and continued with my normal routine, teaching my Year 4 class and marking endless spelling tests. 3 weeks passed with no response. I checked my application status on the council portal and found something strange. There was no record of any video assessment being requested. According to their system, my application was still sitting in the initial review stage, waiting to be processed. No mention of Teach Assess Pro or any additional screening. I called the HR department to ask about the discrepancy. The woman I spoke to seemed confused by my question. She checked her records and confirmed they hadn't sent any requests for video assessments. Their recruitment process didn't include that stage. She asked me to forward the email I'd received, and after a pause while she reviewed it, told me she'd need to escalate this to their IT security team. That's when I started to feel uneasy. If the council hadn't sent that email, who had? And why would someone create a fake assessment platform just to record candidates talking about teaching strategies? The council's security team contacted me the following day. They explained that several other applicants had received similar emails and completed the same fake assessment. The email had been carefully crafted to look official, using stolen branding and imitating the council's communication style. The Teach Assess Pro website appeared legitimate, but was actually created solely to collect video recordings of applicants. What concerned them most was that the fake email had been sent only to people who'd applied for that specific position. Whoever created it had access to the applicant list, which should have been confidential internal information. They were investigating whether their recruitment system had been compromised or if someone inside the organization was involved. I asked what would happen to the video I'd recorded, and the security officer admitted they didn't know. The website had been taken down, but the recordings had probably been saved before that happened. She recommended I monitor my social media and online presence for any misuse of the footage, though she couldn't tell me what form that misuse might take. For the next few weeks, I searched for my name and image regularly, checking if the video had been posted anywhere public. I found nothing, which should have been reassuring, but instead made me more anxious. If someone had gone to such elaborate lengths to collect these recordings, they must have had a specific purpose in mind. About 2 months later, I received a message through LinkedIn from an account I didn't recognize. No profile picture, minimal information. Clearly a fake account created recently. The message contained only a link and a brief note telling me I should see what they'd done with my audition. Every instinct told me not to click that link, but I needed to know what had happened to that recording. The URL was one of those random strings of characters that indicated a dark web address, meaningless unless you knew how to access it. I spent an evening researching how these hidden websites worked, feeling increasingly uncomfortable with each step. The process was less complicated than I'd imagined, though each action felt like crossing into territory I shouldn't. But I needed to see what was waiting at that address, needed to understand why someone had targeted those job applications specifically. The website that loaded was designed like a casting agency portfolio. Professional layout, organized categories, search functions. But instead of actors or models, it featured ordinary people recorded without their knowledge or consent, organized by profession and appearance. My video was there, along with recordings from the other teachers who'd fallen for the same fake assessment. But we weren't alone. The site contained hundreds of videos, maybe thousands, from people in various professions: teachers, nurses, social workers, care home workers, all recorded in similar circumstances, answering interview questions or completing work-related assessments, completely unaware these recordings would end up here. Each video had been edited and presented like a professional headshot, with overlaid text listing the person's qualifications, location, and other details presumably extracted from their job applications. Beneath each video was a contact form and a price list for different types of services. It took me several minutes to understand what I was looking at. This wasn't just a collection of stolen videos. It was a marketplace where people could hire individuals for purposes the victims would never agree to if asked directly. The videos served as samples, showing potential clients what each person looked like, how they spoke, how they presented themselves. The listings made my stomach turn. Teachers available for private tutoring sessions that would never actually be tutoring. Care workers available for home visits that had nothing to do with care. Social workers available for consultations that were anything but professional. All presented with a veneer of legitimacy, using our real qualifications and experience to make the services seem credible. My own listing described me as available for educational consultations and private instruction, with my actual teaching credentials and school listed as verification of expertise. The implication was clear. Someone could hire me through this site, claiming they wanted legitimate tutoring, and I'd have no idea I was walking into something completely different. The contact forms directed inquiries to handlers who presumably managed the logistics of setting up these encounters. I couldn't see the messages or know if anyone had actually responded to my listing, but the view counter showed my video had been accessed over 200 times. I documented everything and contacted the police immediately. They took it seriously, connecting me with officers who specialized in online exploitation. They explained that these schemes had become increasingly sophisticated, using targeted job applications as a way to collect detailed information and professional quality recordings of specific demographics. The fake assessments served multiple purposes. The videos themselves became marketing material. The application information provided background details that made the services seem legitimate, and the professional context made victims more likely to trust initial contact from supposed clients. What made it particularly insidious was that the victims often didn't realize anything was wrong until they'd already attended a supposed consultation or tutoring session. They'd receive what seemed like a legitimate inquiry through proper channels, meet someone who claimed to need their professional services, and only discover the truth when the situation became dangerous. The police investigation uncovered that several teachers whose videos appeared on that site had been contacted by people claiming to need private tutoring. Some had attended initial meetings before realizing the requests weren't genuine. Others had provided their personal contact information to supposed clients who then used it for harassment or stalking. One woman, a teaching assistant from Leeds, had been assaulted after agreeing to a home tutoring session that she thought was legitimate. She'd received an inquiry through what appeared to be a proper tutoring agency, complete with references and professional correspondence. She had no idea her video and information had been circulating on that dark web marketplace, or that the supposed parent who'd hired her had found her there specifically. The website was eventually taken down, but the police confirmed the data had been copied and distributed before they could act. My video, along with hundreds of others, was presumably saved on multiple servers and shared across various platforms they couldn't access or control. I changed my phone number and email address, made all my social media accounts private, withdrew my LinkedIn profile. I informed my current school about the situation so they'd be aware if anyone made suspicious inquiries. I started varying my routine, taking different routes home, being hyper-aware of anyone who seemed to be paying too much attention. But the worst part was not knowing if someone had already contacted me. I reviewed months of emails, looking for any requests that might have come from people who'd seen that listing. A parent asking about private tutoring, who'd seemed slightly off during our phone conversation. A woman who'd inquired about exam prep sessions but never followed up. A supposed education consultant who'd wanted to meet for coffee to discuss opportunities. Any of those could have been legitimate, or any of them could have been something else entirely. Attempts to arrange meetings with me based on having seen my video on that marketplace. I'd never know which inquiries were genuine and which came from people who viewed me as a service they could purchase. I receive occasional messages now, usually through platforms I'd forgotten I had accounts on. Generic inquiries about tutoring or educational consulting that seem reasonable on the surface but feel wrong in ways I can't quite articulate. I never respond to any of them, but I can't help wondering how many teachers are responding, agreeing to meet people who found them through that site, walking into situations they don't understand. The council never found out how their recruitment system was compromised. Either someone internal leaked the applicant information, or someone external had found a way to access it. The investigation was eventually closed without any arrests, though they implemented new security measures for future recruitment processes. I didn't get that job I'd applied for, obviously. The whole recruitment round was cancelled after the breach was discovered. I'm still teaching at the same school, in the same Year 4 classroom, marking the same endless spelling tests. It's safe and familiar, but I can't bring myself to apply for other positions now. The thought of submitting an application, not knowing if it will lead to another fake assessment, another video circulating in hidden corners of the internet, is too much. Sometimes I search for my name, checking if that video has surfaced anywhere public. I've never found it, which means it's probably still circulating in spaces I can't access, still being viewed by people I'll never identify, still marketing services I never agreed to provide. That uncertainty is worse than knowing, the constant awareness that somewhere online, I'm still listed and available. What haunts me most is thinking about all the other teachers on that site, the nurses and social workers and care workers whose videos were collected and distributed. How many of them know what happened? How many have received suspicious inquiries they dismissed as awkward but harmless? How many have already attended consultations or sessions that turned dangerous? I wanted to warn them, to somehow contact everyone whose videos appeared on that marketplace. But I don't know who they are, and reaching out to strangers to tell them their videos have been stolen and distributed would probably seem like another suspicious message from someone who'd found them through that site. So instead, I just live with the knowledge, checking my messages carefully, questioning every professional inquiry I receive, wondering if the person I'm talking to is someone who's seen that video and thinks they've hired me for something I'd never consent to. The paranoia has become part of my routine now, as automatic as locking doors or checking windows. My video is still out there somewhere, and there's nothing I can do about it except hope that whoever has it loses interest, that the marketplace stays shut down, that no one else contacts me claiming they need a tutor. But I know that's probably wishful thinking. Once something exists on the internet, particularly in those hidden spaces most people never see, it exists forever, available to anyone who knows where to look, and somewhere someone is looking. The blue light of my monitor painted my face in stark relief, a pale mask in the otherwise suffocating darkness of my bedroom. The constant, low hum of the cooling fan was the only sound I trusted. Outside, Basingstoke slept, quiet and indifferent. Inside, my stomach churned, a knot of anticipation and dread wrestling for dominance. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, a slight tremor running through them. Tonight was the night I finally stopped being Dan, the boy who tasted blood and dirt every time Chris decided to have a joke. I remembered the last time Chris had cornered me behind the bike sheds, the casual cruelty in his eyes, the way he'd laughed, a loud, booming sound that made the air vibrate as he shoved my face into the muddy grass. The physical pain faded, but the humiliation remained, a sharp shard lodged in my throat. Sometimes I'd catch Sarah looking at me in the canteen. Sarah, quiet, always drawing in her notebook, the only person in that entire awful school who'd ever offered me a half smile, a small, distant light in the dark. Now, even that light felt unreachable. The tinny voice, distorted by the modulator, sliced through the quiet. It was the faceless man. He asked if I was absolutely certain. Yes, I rasped, the word feeling thin and inadequate against the immense weight of the decision. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic thump-thump. He reminded me the price was steep, irreversible. I told him I knew. The money, my life savings, was already gone, a ghost payment into untraceable crypto. A small price, I rationalized, for the sweet, clean taste of justice. He confirmed the target's identity, Chris, 16, strong. He then mentioned his operatives were highly skilled, working with surgical precision. The target wouldn't know what hit him. A cold thrill, sharp and exhilarating, snaked through me. I could only manage a shaky, good. The package will be delivered, the faceless man stated, his tone chillingly professional. And the feed? I asked, needing the confirmation, the proof of my power. He assured me the live stream would commence once Chris was secured, delivered via a private encrypted link, untraceable. Excellent, he concluded, and his avatar vanished, leaving only the blackness of the dark web browser. It was done. I leaned back, the plastic of the chair groaning under my weight. My hands shook so violently I had to clench them into fists. A quiet, terrifying resolve settled over me. The next day at school, the world felt unreal. The noise of the corridors, the smell of stale chips and disinfectant, it was all muted. I scanned every corner, searching for the familiar hulking shape. No Chris. His absence was a yawning silence, a hole in the fabric of the school day. My initial panic, had they failed, was quickly replaced by a quiet, deep satisfaction. No booming laughter, no sneering remarks. The air felt lighter, cleaner. I kept my head down, terrified that my secret, the dark, monstrous thing I had commissioned, was visible to the world. That evening, the email arrived. A single cryptic link. My hands trembled as I clicked. The screen resolved into a grainy, low-light image. A dark room. A single exposed bulb hung from the ceiling, casting harsh, unforgiving shadows. And there, in the center, tied to a sturdy wooden chair, was Chris. He was gagged. A strip of black cloth pulled tight across his mouth, his cheeks pushed out. His eyes, wide and bloodshot, darted around the room, filled with a primal, visceral terror. His struggles were weak, his wrists and ankles bound with thick industrial rope. He wore only jogging bottoms, his bare chest heaving with ragged, desperate breaths. "Welcome back, Dan," the faceless man's voice purred from my speakers, startlingly clear despite the modulation. "Your show is about to begin." A figure stepped into the frame, a hulking silhouette draped in a dark, hooded cloak. He moved with a heavy, deliberate slowness. Chris's eyes widened, his body tensing, a muffled whimper escaping his gag. The figure produced a small, sharp knife. The blade gleamed under the harsh light. "He needs to understand the gravity of his actions, Dan," the faceless man explained, his voice sounding like dry leaves rustling. "A lesson in consequences." The figure approached Chris and, with a terrifying lack of emotion, pressed the tip of the knife against Chris's bicep. Chris's muscles jumped. A thin line of red welled up, then thickened, trickling down his arm. Chris screamed, a raw, piercing sound that was barely muffled by the gag. His body convulsed, pulling frantically against the ropes. My stomach clenched. I felt a cold detachment, a horrifying sense of power. This was real. This was the monster who tormented me, reduced to nothing. The figure began to trace patterns on Chris's skin, shallow cuts that bled freely. Chris's screams became hoarse, ragged gasps. He slumped forward, exhausted, but his eyes remained open, fixed on the camera, a burning accusation. "He's quite resilient," the faceless man observed clinically. "But resilience only prolongs the enjoyment." The hooded figure produced a small black device, an electric cattle prod. The air around the tip gave a faint, chilling crackle of blue discharge as he tested it. Chris whimpered, his body trembling uncontrollably. "This is where the real fun begins," the faceless man announced, an undeniable cruelty in his voice. "Are you enjoying the view, Dan?" I couldn't speak. My mouth was dry, my tongue thick. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead, a nauseous wave washing over me. But I couldn't tear my eyes away. The figure pressed the prod against Chris's bare thigh. Chris convulsed violently, his entire body arching upwards, a choked, agonizing screech tearing from his lungs. The faint, metallic scent of ozone and something burnt seemed to waft through the screen. Again. Crackle. Chris spasmed, his head lolling back, sweat and tears mingling on his face. The imposing bully was gone, replaced by a broken, whimpering mess. A wave of intense icy pity briefly threatened to overwhelm me, but I shoved it down, burying it beneath the memory of every insult, every punch. He deserved this. He had earned this agony. "He's almost broken," the faceless man sighed, a sound of mild disappointment. "Such a shame. We had so many more interesting applications." The hooded figure stepped back. Chris hung limply in the chair, his breathing shallow. "But fear not, Dan," the faceless man continued, a sudden, sharp edge entering his voice. "The night is still young. And we have other guests joining us shortly." My brow furrowed in confusion. Other guests. Just then, a door creaked open in the background. 2 more hooded figures entered the room, dragging something between them. My blood turned to ice. It was another person. A girl. She was unconscious, her long brown hair splayed across her pale face. Her school uniform, grey skirt and red trim, was rumpled and dirty. It was Sarah. My stomach dropped with sickening force. Sarah, the quiet girl who drew in her notebook. "No," I whispered, the sound catching in my throat. "Ah, yes, Sarah," the faceless man purred, confirming my worst fear. "A lovely addition, wouldn't you agree? Chris's little friend, perhaps? Or merely a convenient symbol?" "She's not involved," I choked out, my voice rising in a desperate plea. "Leave her alone. She has nothing to do with this." "But Dan, my dear boy," the faceless man's tone was laced with mock surprise. "You commissioned an experience. And what's an experience without a little emotional leverage?" The new figures tied Sarah to another chair, positioning her directly opposite Chris. Chris, despite his weakened state, stirred. His eyes flickered open, focusing on Sarah. A fresh wave of terror, mingled with something that looked like anguish and self-loathing, twisted his features. "We believe in a holistic approach, Dan," the faceless man explained, a pedagogical drone now. "Chris needs to understand the full outward impact of his life choices. And what better way than to involve those he cares about?" "He doesn't care about her," I screamed, my voice raw. "He barely knows her. She was just kind." "But I think he does now," the faceless man countered, a sinister chuckle. "Look at his face, Dan. That's not indifference. That's pure, beautiful despair." One of the new figures produced a syringe. He approached Sarah. "What are you doing?" I demanded, my hand slamming uselessly against my desk. "Just a little something to ensure she's awake for the grand finale," the faceless man said, dripping with malice. "We wouldn't want her to miss out." The figure injected Sarah. Her body twitched, her eyelids fluttering open briefly, revealing glazed, confused eyes before she went limp again. "No, stop it." I was sobbing now, hot, stinging tears blurring my vision. This wasn't revenge. This was pure, indiscriminate malice. "The plan, Dan, was to provide you with a memorable experience," the faceless man corrected, impatience creeping in. "And we are delivering. Beyond your wildest, most pathetic dreams." The hooded figure who had tortured Chris now approached Sarah, holding the cattle prod. Chris thrashed in his chair, a strangled, desperate cry of protest escaping his gag. His eyes fixed on Sarah were pleading, begging. "The true torment isn't always physical, Dan," the faceless man lectured. "It's watching someone you value suffer, knowing you are powerless to stop it. That, my dear boy, is true agony." The figure pressed the cattle prod against Sarah's arm. She screamed, a raw, piercing sound that cut through the silence of my room. It wasn't the muffled scream of Chris. It was clean, sharp, and utterly devastating. Chris roared, a guttural, animalistic sound, his struggles renewed with terrifying ferocity. He pulled against the ropes, muscles straining, his chair scraping loudly. Screech! "No!" I screamed, my voice tearing. "Stop it! Leave her alone. Take me instead. I'm the one who paid you." "Oh, Dan," the faceless man sighed, a sound of feigned disappointment. "Such chivalry. But alas, the show must go on, and you, my friend, are the audience of honor." The figure continued to torment Sarah, each jolt sending her into spasms. Chris watched, his face a mask of pure, self-immolating horror, his own pain utterly forgotten. "What do you want?" I choked out, sinking in my chair. "Just stop." "We want entertainment," the faceless man replied. "We want to see the breaking point, and you, Dan, have provided us with an exquisite opportunity. We are always looking for new talent, Dan. You have a certain aptitude for this, don't you? The desire to inflict pain, the hunger for control. It's a powerful motivator." "No," I whispered, shaking my head violently. I just wanted him to understand. "And he does, Dan," the faceless man chuckled. "But now, the question is, do you understand the true nature of power?" The hooded figure raised the prod again, aiming for Sarah's face. "No, stop," I shrieked, my throat raw. "I'll do it. I'll join you. Just don't hurt her. I'll be one of yours." The figure paused, the prod hovering inches from Sarah's cheek. Chris slumped forward, his breath ragged, the immediate threat averted. "An excellent choice, Dan," the faceless man purred, a note of ultimate triumph in his voice. "Welcome to the family. You've made a very wise decision." The screen flickered and the feed cut out. The room was plunged into darkness, save for the faint blue glow of the monitor. The silence that followed was deafening, suffocating. I sat there, hunched over my desk, my body trembling, my mind a maelstrom of horror. My breath came in shallow, painful gasps. The images, the screams, the smell of burnt flesh, they were seared into my brain. I had wanted revenge. I had wanted Chris to suffer. But I had never wanted to destroy the only shred of goodness I knew, nor had I wanted to become this thing. The faceless man's words echoed in the terrifying vacuum. Welcome to the family. I had crossed a line, a dark, irreversible chasm. I had traded my soul for a moment of twisted satisfaction, and now I was trapped, bound by a contract written in blood and fear. I was no longer Dan, the bullied nerd. I was a collaborator, a conspirator, a new monster waiting to be deployed. My phone buzzed, a new email. I stared at the notification, my heart convulsing in my chest. It was from the faceless man. The subject line read, "Your first assignment. Acquisition protocol attached." My fingers, still trembling, slowly moved towards the mouse. The blue light of the monitor reflected in my tear-filled eyes, a silent witness to the darkness that had consumed me. I clicked the link,